Clara Whitaker set the cast-iron skillet down so hard it cracked the table, and every man in that kitchen went dead silent. "You can starve on your pride," she said, "or you can sit down and eat, but not one of you will call me useless again." Her husband had told her that very morning that marrying her was the worst mistake he'd ever made. By nightfall, 12 grown men would be fighting over the last piece of her bread. If you're watching, subscribe. Stay with me to the very end. And comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far Clara's story travels tonight. The stagecoach hadn't even come to a full stop before the whispering started. Clara Bennett gripped the doorframe and lowered herself down onto Montana soil. 2 worn leather bags in one hand and a folded marriage certificate in the other. And she felt every pair of eyes on the Whitaker ranch turn toward her at once. She was a large woman. She had always been a large woman, and she had learned a long time ago that there was a particular kind of silence that fell over people when they saw her for the first time. A silence that was really just a held breath before the laughing began. It began now. "That's the bride," one of the ranch hands said, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Lord have mercy. Whitaker ordered a wife and got a whole church social." A few of the men chuckled. One of them elbowed another. And Clara, standing in the dust with her chin level and her heart hammering, did not flinch. She'd have flinched at 19. At 27, she had spent too many years learning how to keep her face still. "Where is he?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Where is Mr. Whitaker?" Nobody answered right away. Then a tall man stepped forward from the shade of the barn, wiping his hands slowly on a rag, and Clara knew before he said a word that this was her husband. Thomas Whitaker was not a cruel-looking man. That was the first thing she noticed, and the thing that surprised her most. She had braced herself for cruelty. Instead, she saw exhaustion, a man worn down to the grain with grief still living somewhere behind his eyes. He looked at her, and she watched his expression fall. Not into anger, into something worse, into disappointment. "You're Clara," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. "I am." He looked at her bags. He looked at her body. He looked at the men who were still smirking behind her, and a muscle moved in his jaw. "I expected." He started and stopped. "You expected someone smaller," Clara said. The bluntness of it caught him off guard. His mouth opened and closed. "I expected someone who'd worked a ranch," he said finally. "That's what the letter promised. A hard worker." "You've got one." "You don't look like Mr. Whitaker." Clara set her bags down in the dirt, and the small thud of them was louder than it should have been. "I've been on that coach for 11 days. I've eaten dust and slept sitting up and been stared at by strangers from Missouri to here. I am tired and I am hungry, and I would very much like to see the house I'm meant to live in. We can decide you've made a mistake later. Right now I'd settle for a glass of water and a place to set down my things." For a moment, nobody moved. Then an older ranch hand, gray-bearded, bow-legged, with a face like cracked leather, let out a low whistle. "Well now," he said. "She's got a mouth on her tom. That's more'n the last 3 you rode away for." "That'll do, Gus," Thomas said. But Gus was already grinning at Clara, and there was no meanness in it. "Name's Gus Halloran, ma'am. I do the cookin' round here, or I did till my hands quit workin' right." He held up 2 knotted, swollen fists, the knuckles gone thick and crooked. "Reckon you'll find the kitchen's the sorriest room on the whole spread." "Then that's where I'd like to start," Clara said. Thomas turned away without another word. He crossed the yard, said something low to a broad-shouldered man near the corral the foreman Clara would learn a man named Silas Reed, and disappeared into the barn like a man who couldn't stand to look at his own choices a second longer. Clara watched him go. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Don't you mind him?" Gus said, shuffling over to pick up one of her bags before she could stop him. "He's been sour as green apples since Eleanor passed. Ain't you personal?" Eleanor was his first wife. His only wife. Till now. Gus caught himself. "No offense meant, ma'am." "None taken." Clara picked up her other bag. "Show me the kitchen, Mr. Halloran." The kitchen, when she saw it, was worse than she'd feared. She stood in the doorway and made herself look at all of it without a single word crossing her face. A cold stove crusted with old grease. A pantry with sacks of flour gone weevily in the corners. Potatoes sprouting pale eyes in a crate. A slab of salt pork that had been cut wrong and left to dry into something closer to shoe leather. Dishes stacked without being scrubbed. A bucket of water gone stale. And over everything, the particular sour smell of a place where people had stopped caring. "How many men do you feed?" she asked. 12 most days, 14 come branding." Gus scratched his beard. Well, we feed 'em. Ain't sure I'd call it more'n that." "When did they last eat something they were glad to eat?" Gus was quiet a moment. "Reckon that'd be back when Eleanor was living. She had a way with a Sunday supper. After she went—" He shrugged one shoulder. "Well, a man cooks to keep folks alive. That's about all I ever managed." Clara set her bags down against the wall. She took off her traveling coat, folded it once, and laid it over the back of the only chair that looked like it might hold weight. Then she rolled up her sleeves. "You just got here," Gus said, watching her. "You don't gotta start tonight. When do the men come in?" "Sundown. Hungry as wolves and twice as mean about it." Clara looked out through the small window at the light already going gold and long. "Then I've got about 3 hours," she said. "Mr. Halloran, I'm going to need your hands one more time, crooked or not. Can you point and tell me where things are, even if you can't lift them?" The old man's leathery face did something complicated. For a second, Clara thought she'd insulted him. Then she realized she'd done the opposite. She'd asked him to matter again. "Yes, ma'am," Gus said, and there was a rasp in it. "That I can do." She worked. She scrubbed the stove down to the black iron and built a fire that drew clean and hot. She hauled fresh water herself, waving off Gus when he tried, because she had spent her whole life proving her body could do the things people assumed it couldn't, and she was not about to stop now. She went through the pantry, sack by sack, crate by crate, throwing out what was ruined and rescuing what wasn't. She found things nobody had thought to look for: a crock of good lard behind the rotten pork, a bag of dried beans, still sound, a tin of coffee, molasses, a little precious sugar. "You throw out that pork," Gus warned, "and you got no meat for tonight." "I'm not going to serve a table of working men shoe leather and call it supper," Clara said. She was already peeling potatoes, her knife moving quick and sure. "What's the nearest thing to fresh you've got? Anything at all?" Gus rubbed his jaw. "Silas shot a couple of jackrabbits this morning, meant to skin 'em for the dogs." "Not anymore, he doesn't." By the time the sun touched the western rim, the kitchen smelled like a different building. Clara had beans slow cooking with molasses, and a hard nub of the good pork rind for flavor. She had bread rising and then baking the crust, going gold and cracking. She had the rabbit browned and simmering in gravy she'd built from drippings and flour and patience enough to stretch across a dozen plates. If she was careful, and she was always careful, she'd learned to feed a lot of people out of a little learned it in a kitchen far away, from a woman who'd taught her that no was just a word other people used before you proved them wrong. She was setting out the last of the plates when the men came in. They came the way hungry, tired men come, loud, dragging their boots, talking over each other, filling the doorway with their bodies and their noise. And then, one by one, they stopped. They stopped because the room smelled like bread. "What in the—" one of them started. "Sit down," Clara said. "All of you, before it goes cold." Or, the men looked at each other. They looked at the table, the bread already cut, the beans steaming, the coffee poured. They looked at the large woman standing at the head of it with a dish towel over her shoulder and an expression that dared any one of them to say a word. The one who'd made the church social joke back in the yard slid onto the bench. He picked up a piece of bread. He turned it over in his hands like he wasn't sure it was real. "Go on," Clara said. He ate, and Clara Whitaker watched the exact moment a grown man remembered what food was supposed to be. His eyes closed. His shoulders dropped an inch. He didn't say anything. He just tore off another piece and ate that too faster, and the second man, seeing him, reached for his own. Then all of them were eating, and the loud kitchen had gone quiet in a way Gus Halloran had not heard in 3 years. He stood in the corner, leaning on the doorframe, and Clara caught the old man's eyes shining wet, and neither of them said anything about it. "Ma'am." A young hand near the middle of the bench had stopped eating. He was maybe 20, freckled with a cowlick that wouldn't lie down, and he was looking at Clara like he'd seen something he couldn't explain. "Ma'am, could I—" He swallowed. "Could I have some more of them beans if there's enough? I don't want to take another man's share." "There's enough," Clara said. "What's your name?" "Caleb, ma'am. Caleb Dawson." She filled his bowl again. When she set it down in front of him, Caleb Dawson looked at it, and then he said something she would carry with her for a long time. "I ain't tasted food like this," he said quietly, "since my mother was alive." The whole table heard it. Nobody laughed. Nobody had laughed since they walked in the door. Clara turned back to the stove so the boy wouldn't see her face, and she busied herself with nothing, and she let the room fill up with the sound of men eating like they mattered. That was the moment she'd been afraid wouldn't come. That was the moment she knew she could do this. Thomas Whitaker came in late. He'd stayed out past dark on purpose. Clara understood that without being told. He'd wanted to miss it. He'd wanted to come in and find the same tired kitchen and the same tired men and be proven right about the wife he never wanted. Instead, he stepped through the door into the smell of fresh bread and a room full of men who were for the first time in a long time content. He stopped. He looked at the table. He looked at the empty pots. "There's a plate for you in the warmer," Clara said, not turning around. "I saved it back. Sit down and eat, Mr. Whitaker." He didn't sit. He crossed to the stove and looked at the last of the beans at the heel of bread she'd kept aside at the gravy scraped nearly clean. His jaw worked. And Clara watched a man wage a small silent war against himself and lose the first battle of it. "You used the pork?" he said finally. "Of all the things. I used the pork rind for flavor and threw out the rest because the rest would have made your men sick," Clara said. "And I used the rabbits Silas meant for the dogs, and the beans that were about to spoil. Nothing you couldn't spare. Everything you'd have wasted. That was tomorrow's meat. That was rot, Mr. Whitaker." She finally turned to face him, and she kept her voice level, but there was steel under it now. "I can feed these men better on what you're throwing away than they've been fed on what you've been keeping. That's not a boast. That's the plain truth, and you can see it sitting at your own table if you'd look." Thomas did look. He couldn't help it. He looked at his men. Men who 3 hours ago had been dragging in exhausted and sour, and who now sat loose-limbed and easy, one of them laughing low at something, Caleb Dawson mopping the last of his gravy with the last of his bread like it was something precious. "Anyone can cook a good meal once," Thomas said. It came out quieter than he meant it to. "You're right," Clara said. "Anyone can. So don't take my word for it. Give me a week. Give me your worst supplies and your leanest week, and let me cook every meal. And at the end of it, you tell me whether I earned my place here or whether you made a mistake." She untied her apron slowly. "And if you decide it was a mistake, Mr. Whitaker, I'll get back on that coach and I won't say another word. But you'll decide it looking at the truth, not looking at me." The kitchen had gone quiet again. Every man at that table had stopped eating to listen. Thomas Whitaker looked at his wife. Really looked at her. Maybe for the first time since she'd stepped down off the stagecoach into the middle of his broken life, and something moved behind his eyes that he did not have a name for yet. "1 week," he said. "1 week." Clara agreed. He took his plate from the warmer. And then, because there was nowhere else to sit that wasn't at the crowded bench with his men, Thomas Whitaker sat down at his own table for the first time in months, and he ate the food his new wife had made, and he did not say another word about it. But he ate every bite. Clara saw that too. The men filed out slow when they were done, and every last one of them said something to her on the way. Not much. A cowboy doesn't say much. But one touched the brim of his hat and said, "Ma'am," in a voice thick with something. Another muttered, "Real fine supper," to his boots. And Caleb Dawson stopped in the doorway and turned back. "You aim to cook again tomorrow, ma'am?" he asked like he was afraid of the answer. Every day, Caleb, Clara said. For as long as they'll have me. The boy grinned so wide it near split his freckled face, and he was gone. Then it was just Clara and Gus in the kitchen with the last of the fire. Well, Gus said. He was doing the dishes she'd told him twice to leave, working the rag slow around a plate with his crooked hands. You went and did it now. Did what? Reminded him. He set the plate down careful. Reminded every one of them men what it feels like to be looked after. Trouble is, ma'am, once a body remembers that he can't hardly stand to go without it again. Gus looked at her, and there was warning in it, and kindness too. You quit on us now, you'll break their hearts worse than if you'd never come. I'm not going to quit. Whitaker might send you off. He might, Clara said, but he won't do it on a full stomach, and I intend to keep this ranch's stomach full until sending me off is the last thing on this earth Thomas Whitaker wants to do. Gus laughed, a real laugh, dry and surprised and delighted. Lord, he said, Eleanor would have liked you. She would have liked you fine. Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She took the rag out of the old man's ruined hands gently and finished the dishes herself. That night, she lay awake in the small room off the kitchen. Thomas had not offered to share his, and she had not asked, and she listened to the strange sounds of a strange house and felt the ache in her back and her feet and her hands, and she was not sorry. She had cooked people back to remembering they were alive. She had done it before in other kitchens for other tables. She would do it here. She thought about the joke in the yard, the church social, the laughing. Let them laugh, she thought. They laughed with their mouths full tonight. Morning came hard and early, the way it always does on a ranch, and Clara was up before any of them, the fire already drawing biscuits already in. She'd meant it about the week. She'd meant every word. But she also knew a week of good food on its own wasn't going to save the Whitaker ranch, and it was going to take more than a full belly to change a man like Thomas. She'd seen the ledger. She hadn't meant to. It had been sitting open on the table when she came in that first morning, and Clara had a habit her mother had scolded her for, and never broken her of, which was that she could not look at numbers without reading them. So she'd read them. And what she'd read had frozen her with the coffee tin halfway to the shelf. The ranch was drowning. Not slowly. Not someday. Now. There were debts coming due that the cattle wouldn't cover, not at the prices the buyers were offering. There were merchants charging Thomas near double what Clara knew supplies to be worth, because Thomas was a grieving man who'd stop checking, and men like that get taken every time. There was waste everywhere in the accounts, as much as in the pantry orders. Duplicated spoilage nobody tracked. A whole system of small bleedings that added up to a ranch dying by inches, while its owner stared at the big wound and missed the 100 little ones. Clara had put the ledger down exactly where she'd found it. She hadn't said a word about it. A wife of one day did not correct a grieving man's arithmetic. Not yet. But she'd remembered every number. She was pulling the biscuits when Silas Reed came in, the foreman, the broad-shouldered man from the corral. He was younger than Thomas, dark-eyed and careful, and he'd said nothing at all the night before. He'd eaten in silence and watched her the whole time in a way she couldn't quite read. Mrs. Whitaker, he said now. Mr. Reed, there's coffee, biscuits in a minute. He poured himself a cup, but didn't drink it. I'll say something if you'll allow it. Go on. Them men out there think you hung the moon this morning. Silas turned the cup slow in his hands. One meal and they're loyal as hounds. I've seen it before. Hungry men'll follow anybody who feeds them. He looked up. I ain't a hungry man, ma'am. Not the kind that's swayed by a supper. So I'll wait and see what you are before I decide. Clara set a fresh biscuit down in front of him. Steam rose off it. That's fair, Mr. Reed, she said. That's the fairest thing anybody's said to me since I got here. You wait and see. I'd think less of you if you didn't. Silas looked at the biscuit. He looked at her. Something in his careful face eased just slightly. Whitaker's a good man, under all that hurt, he said quietly. He lost Eleanor and the baby both same winter. Same week near enough. Ain't been right since. He picked up the biscuit. I'm telling you so you'll be patient with him. Not so you'll excuse him. There's a difference. Clara went very still. The baby, she said. Boy, didn't live but a day. Silas ate the biscuit in 2 bites, and his eyes closed the same way the men's had the night before. And when he opened them again, there was something rueful in them, like he was annoyed at himself for being won over so easy. That's good, he admitted. That's real good, ma'am. Damn it. Then he set his cup down and walked out, and Clara stood alone in the kitchen with a fresh understanding of the man she'd married. A wife, a son. Both gone in a week, and into that house of grief the world had sent him her. A large, plain, blunt-spoken stranger off a stagecoach arriving on his doorstep like a bill come due. No wonder he couldn't look at her. She wasn't a wife to Thomas Whitaker. She was proof that Eleanor was never coming back. Clara pressed her hand flat against the warm iron of the stove and let herself feel the sorrow of it all the way through, the way she let herself feel most things once and then set them down. Then she picked up her spoon and got back to work, because sorrow never fed anybody, and there were 12 men coming in hungry. The week turned. Clara cooked. She cooked breakfast in the dark and dinner at midday and supper at sundown, and every meal was better than the men had a right to expect, and every meal she stretched a little further than anyone thought it could go. She salvaged. She substituted. She turned nothing into enough and enough into plenty. And the ranch hands stopped being surprised by it and started expecting it, and then this was the dangerous part. The part Gus had warned her about, they started needing it. She learned their names, all 12. She learned that Caleb Dawson was an orphan who'd lied about his age to get hired. She learned that the man who'd made the church social joke was called Bristol, and that under the meanness, he was just scared a drifter who'd never had a place. And she started saving him the crustiest heel of bread, because she'd noticed he liked it, and after 3 days of that, Bristol couldn't quite meet her eye anymore. Couldn't quite keep up the sneering, because it's hard to sneer at a woman who's paying that close attention to what makes you glad. By the 4th day, the men were coming in early. Not much. 10 minutes, maybe 15. They'd finish their work and drift toward the kitchen a little sooner than they had to, and stand around outside the door talking, waiting, drawn to the light and the warmth and the smell, like moths to a lamp. Clara pretended not to notice, but she noticed. She noticed everything, and Thomas noticed too. He watched his ranch change around him, and he didn't know what to make of it. His men worked harder. A well-fed man works harder. It's the plainest fact of ranching, and he'd let himself forget it. They complained less. They quarreled less. The whole spread had a different feeling to it, looser and warmer. And at the center of it, in the kitchen, was the wife he'd been so sure was a mistake. He was not ready to admit it. Clara could see that. He was a proud man and a hurt man, and those two things together make a wall thick enough to keep out a lot of truth. But she caught him more than once standing in the yard at supper time, looking at the light in the kitchen window with an expression she was starting to understand. Not softness, not yet, but the beginning of a question. On the 6th day, the question came out. He caught her alone after supper, the men gone to the bunkhouse, Gus off to bed. How? Thomas said. Clara looked up from the dishes. How, what, Mr. Whitaker? How are you feeding 14 men better than I fed 12 on less than I was spending? His voice wasn't angry. It was baffled, and there was something almost desperate under the bafflement. I've been over the accounts. You're spending less, and they're eating like kings. That isn't possible. There's a trick in it somewhere. There's no trick. There has to be. There's no trick, Mr. Whitaker. There's just attention. Clara dried her hands and turned to face him. You want the truth, you've been robbed. Not by anybody wicked. By your own not looking. Bledsoe at the Mercantile's been charging you 1/3 over fair price on flour and near double on coffee for the better part of a year because he knows you don't check, and he's a greedy little man who takes what he can. Your last 3 supply orders had the same sack of beans on them ordered 3 times, because nobody was tracking what came in against what got used. You've got spoilage running out the back door faster than cattle running out the front, and you never counted it because it never had a number. She said it plain without cruelty, laying it out like a doctor naming a sickness. It's not that I'm spending less to feed them better. It's that you were spending twice what you needed to feed them worse. I just stopped the bleeding." Thomas stared at her. For a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. And Clara braced herself because she'd just told a proud man that he'd been a fool, and proud men don't take that kindly, and she'd known when she opened her mouth that she was risking the whole week on this one hard truth. "Bledsoe," Thomas said slowly. "A third over on flour. I can show you. I kept the wrappers." "You kept the wrappers. I keep everything, Mr. Whitaker. It's a failing my mother despaired of." Clara almost smiled. "Comes in handy." Thomas Whitaker sat down heavily at the table. He put his hand over his mouth and stared at the wood grain, and Clara watched the fight go on behind his eyes. The pride wanting to be angry, the drowning man wanting to grab the rope, the grief tangled up in all of it, because Eleanor had kept the books once, and he'd never learned to do it half so well, and had been too broken to try. "Show me," he said finally into his hand. "The wrappers, the numbers, all of it. Show me tomorrow." "I will." He got up. He went to the door. And then he stopped with his hand on the frame, and without turning around, he said the thing that cost him the most. "The week's not up till tomorrow night," Thomas said. "But you don't have to worry about that coach, Mrs. Whitaker. You're not going anywhere." He was gone before she could answer. Clara stood alone in the kitchen with her hands still damp from the dishwater, and she found to her own surprise that her eyes had gone hot. Not because he'd praised her. He hadn't, not really. He'd said it gruff and grudging, with his back turned, a man conceding ground he hated to lose. But it was the first time in her whole life that a place had told her she could stay before she'd finished earning it. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist and finished the dishes. The seventh day, she showed him the wrappers. She spread them across the table in the gray of early morning, before the men were up, and she walked Thomas Whitaker through his own ruin line by line. The flour, the coffee, the doubled beans, the spoilage, the whole slow bleeding of it. And Thomas, who had expected to feel humiliated, found instead that he felt something he'd forgotten he could feel. He felt hope, because a ranch that's dying of bad luck can't be saved. But a ranch that's dying of not looking that can be fixed by a person who looks. And that person was standing in his kitchen with flour on her sleeves and a certainty in her voice that he was beginning to trust more than he trusted his own grief. "How much?" he said. "If we do all of it, the mercantile, the tracking, the waste, how much does it save?" Clara had the number ready. She always had the number ready, she told him. Thomas sat back. It wasn't enough to save the ranch. He knew that, and she knew that, and neither of them pretended otherwise. The debts were too big, the cattle prices too low, the drought already starting to whisper its threat across the summer grass. Saving the pantry didn't save the ranch. But it was enough to buy time. And time, Thomas Whitaker was starting to understand, was exactly the thing this woman was good at making out of nothing. "Bledsoe," he said again. There was something new in his voice now. Not defeat, the opposite of it. "I'm riding into town this morning. You're coming with me." "Me. You kept the wrappers. You know the numbers. I want him looking at the person who caught him." Thomas stood, and then Clara would remember this would turn it over in her mind for a long time after he did something he had not done once since she stepped off that stagecoach. He looked at her straight on, with no disappointment in it at all. "Get your coat, Mrs. Whitaker," Thomas Whitaker said. "Let's go get our money back." Clara Whitaker reached for her coat. And outside, though, neither of them knew it yet, the summer sky was already going the hard, brassy, cloudless white that Montana men had learned to fear. The color that meant the rains weren't coming, that meant the grass would burn brown and the creeks would sink to mud. That meant the hardest test the Whitaker Ranch had ever faced was gathering itself just beyond the horizon. But that morning, Clara didn't look at the sky. She looked at her husband holding the door open for her for the very first time, and she stepped through it. The ride into town was long and quiet, and Clara spent most of it holding the flour wrappers against her knee, like a hand of cards she wasn't ready to show. Thomas drove the wagon with his hat pulled low and said nothing for the first 3 miles. Clara led him. She'd learned that a man working up to something needed room to do it, and Thomas Whitaker was working up to a great many things. An apology he couldn't quite form. A fear he couldn't quite name, a wife he couldn't quite figure. So she watched the road and waited, and after a while, he cleared his throat. "Bledsoe's not a small man," he said. "I saw him through the window when the coach came in. I don't mean his size, I mean his standing. He's on the church board. He holds paper on half the small ranches in the county." Thomas flicked the reins. "Cross him wrong and he can make things hard. He can whisper in the bank's ear, and the bank's already got its hand around my throat as it is. So you're telling me to be careful." "I'm telling you that when we get in there, you let me do the talking." Clara turned and looked at him. "No," she said. Thomas nearly dropped the reins. "No. You've been letting him rob you for a year because you didn't look. I looked, so I'll talk." She said it gently, but there was no give in it. "You want him to know he can't do it anymore? Mr. Whitaker, then the person who caught him is the person he needs to hear it from. If you fight my battle for me, he'll figure the whole thing was your notion, and I'm just the wife you sent to soften it. Then next month he'll go back to skimming, because he'll know you don't check. You just get sore when somebody else does." She smoothed the wrappers on her knee. "Let him look at me. Let him understand that the person minding your money now is a person who misses nothing. That's worth more than anything you could say to him." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. The wagon creaked. A meadowlark called somewhere off in the brown grass. "Eleanor never talked to Bledsoe like that," he said finally. Clara's hands went still. "I'm not Eleanor, Mr. Whitaker." "No." Thomas kept his eyes on the road. "No, you sure ain't." And Clara couldn't tell from the flat way he said it whether it was a wound or a relief, and she decided she wasn't going to ask, because some questions you don't ask a grieving man on a wagon with 3 miles still to go. The Mercantile sat on the main street, with Bledsoe's name painted gold across the window, and Cyrus Bledsoe himself was behind the counter when they walked in, a soft, round, pink-cheeked man with a merchant's smile that arrived a half-second before it was wanted. Thomas Whitaker. He spread his hands wide. "Well, if it isn't, and you've brought—" The smile flickered just for an instant as his eyes landed on Clara, and did the arithmetic every stranger's eyes did. "This must be the new Mrs. Whitaker. We heard you'd sent away for a bride, Thomas, but nobody mentioned—" He caught himself, but not quite in time, and the "not quite" hung in the air. "Nobody mentioned what, Mr. Bledsoe?" Clara asked pleasantly. "Nothing at all, ma'am. Welcome to town." He turned back to Thomas with the smile fully restored. "What can I do for you, Moorflower? I know you go through it with all those hands to feed. I could let you have 3 sacks at the usual." "What is the usual, Mr. Bledsoe?" Clara set the wrappers on the counter, one at a time, laying them flat, smoothing each one. "I ask because I've been comparing. This wrapper here is from March, this one's from May, and this little slip," she set down a folded piece of newsprint, "is a price list from the Mercantile over in Bighorn, which I had the coachman fetch me on the way through, because I'm a curious woman and I like to know what things cost." Bledsoe's smile stayed fixed, but something behind it went very still. "Now Bighorn's 40 miles off," Clara went on in the same warm, unhurried voice. "So I'd expect you to charge a little more. Freight costs money. A nickel on the sack maybe. A dime and I wouldn't blink. But your flour, Mr. Bledsoe, runs a full third over Bighorn's. And your coffee's near double. And I got to wondering, is freight to this town really twice what it is to Bighorn? Or is it that Thomas Whitaker's a grieving man who stopped counting, and you noticed, and you decided a grieving man's money spends the same as anybody's?" The Mercantile had gone silent. 2 other customers had stopped pretending not to listen. Bledsoe's pink face had gone a shade pinker. "Now see here," he said. "I don't know what you're implying, but I run an honest—" "I'm not implying anything, Mr. Bledsoe. I'm reading you your own numbers." Clara tapped the wrappers 1, 2, 3. "I've got a year of these. Every sack, every tin. My husband kept them all and never once looked, and I looked at every one. And what they add up to? She named the figure. She named it plain the way she'd named it to Thomas in the kitchen, and it landed on the counter with a weight the whole store could feel. That's what you've taken over fair price this past year. From a man who buried his wife and his son the same week and trusted you to deal square with him while he grieved. Somebody by the door made a low sound. Bledsoe's mouth opened. Nothing came out. And Thomas Whitaker, standing a half-step behind his wife with his hat in his hands, watched the round pink man, who'd been quietly bleeding him for a year, turn from a figure of intimidation into a figure of shame. And he felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long, long time. He felt taken care of. There may have been bookkeeping errors, Bledsoe managed. Freight fluctuates. I'd have to review. I'm sure you would, Clara said kindly. So here's what I'd propose, and I think you'll find it more than fair considering. From today, we pay Bighorn's price plus a dime a sack for your trouble. And the year of overcharges. She smiled. We'll call it credit, against future orders. You keep our business, your name stays clean, and nobody in this town ever hears the word that a church board man robbed a widower blind. That seems generous to me, Mr. Bledsoe. More generous than you were. Bledsoe looked at her. He looked at Thomas. He looked at the two customers who had heard every word and would carry it to every kitchen in the county by supper if he gave them a reason. Credit, he said hoarsely. Against future orders. Yes, that's yes. Very reasonable, Mrs. Whitaker. I thought so. I'll draw up the terms. You do that. My husband will sign them once I've read them. Clara gathered her wrappers, folding each one, tucking them away. Thank you, Mr. Bledsoe. We'll take 3 sacks of flour today. At the new price. I've got hungry men to feed. They walked out into the brassy white daylight, and Thomas didn't say a word until they'd loaded the flour and climbed back up onto the wagon and rolled clear of the main street. Then he started laughing. It came out of him rough and rusty, like a pump that hadn't been worked in years, and Clara turned to stare at him because she'd never heard the sound and hadn't been sure he was capable of it. His face? Thomas got out. His face when you set down that bighorn slip. Lord Almighty, I've wanted to say something to that man for... He shook his head, wiping his eyes. A year. A whole year I let him take me, and it never once crossed my mind to fetch a price list from Bighorn. You had other things on your mind. I had grief on my mind, and grief made me stupid. He said it lightly, but Clara heard what was underneath it, and she didn't correct him. Grief makes everybody stupid, Mr. Whitaker. It's the most natural thing in the world. That's exactly why men like Bledsoe do what they do. They know a hurting man won't check. Costs you nothing to be gentle with yourself about it. Thomas glanced at her. The laughter had faded, but something warmer had stayed behind it. You keep calling me Mr. Whitaker, he said. That's your name. You're my wife. I'm your wife because a letter said so, and a certificate said so. Clara kept her eyes on the road. I'm not going to call you Thomas like we're something we're not just because it'd be tidier. When you want me to call you Thomas, you'll tell me, and you'll mean it. Till then, Mr. Whitaker suits me fine. Thomas didn't answer that. But something in his shoulders eased, and they rode the rest of the way home in a quiet that was for the first time comfortable. That comfort lasted exactly 9 days. On the 10th, the sky broke its promise. It had been threatening all summer, the brassy white, the wind gone dry and hot, the grass losing its green from the tips down. The old-timers had been muttering about it, and Gus had been watching the horizon with a face that got grimmer by the week. But Montana summers were hard, and hard didn't always mean ruinous, and Clara had let herself hope in the busy rhythm of cooking and counting, and slowly winning her way into the life of the ranch, that the whispered fear would come to nothing. Then came the morning. Silas Reed rode in from the north pasture at a gallop and swung down off his horse before it had fully stopped, and Clara knew from the way he moved that hope was over. Creek's down to a trickle, Silas said. He'd come straight to the kitchen because that was where things got decided now, and everyone had started to understand that even if nobody had said it out loud. The North Creek. It's near Dry Tom. Overnight. Thomas set down his coffee. It can't be dry. It was running Tuesday. It was running Tuesday. It's mud today. Silas took off his hat and dragged his sleeve across his forehead. And the grass in the north pastures going with it. Another week of this, and we'll have cattle standing in dust looking for water that ain't there. The kitchen went silent. Caleb Dawson, who'd been lingering over his breakfast, went pale. "How many head in the north pasture?" Clara asked. "Near 200. Silas looked at her, and there was something almost apologetic in it, like he was sorry to be handing her a problem this size. "That's more'n half the herd, ma'am, and the herd's about all that's standing between this ranch and the bank." Thomas stood up so fast his chair scraped. "We move them. We drive them south to the Home Creek. Home Creek's low too, Tom. It'll water the 200 we already got down here, or the 200 up north. Not both. Not through a dry August." Silas turned his hat in his hands. "We put 400 head on one failing creek. We don't lose 200 to drought. We lose all 400 to crowding and bad water and the sickness that comes with it. I've seen it happen. It happens fast." The words hung in the kitchen like smoke, and Clara watched Thomas Whitaker's face do the thing she'd been dreading since she read his ledger. She watched hope drain out of it, and the old drowning look come back, the look of a man who has decided the water is going to close over his head no matter how he thrashes. So why thrash? "Then it's over," Thomas said quietly. "Whether we lose 200 head or 4, we can't cover the note either way. Bledsoe's credit your good cooking, none of it matters now. You save $1 in the pantry and lose 1,000 in the pasture." He sat back down heavily and put his head in his hands. "It's over. It was always going to be over. I was a fool to think He stopped, but Clara heard the rest of it anyway. "I was a fool to think a mail-order bride could save what a drought means to take." She didn't take offense. She didn't have time to. Because while Thomas was surrendering, Clara's mind had already left the kitchen and gone out to the road she'd traveled to get here the 11 days on the coach. The towns, the way stations. The things she'd seen out the window that a defeated man wouldn't have thought twice about, but that a curious woman who missed nothing had filed carefully away. "Silas," she said. "Yesterday you rode the East Line, past the old Miller place." Silas blinked at the change of subject. "I did." "Is that grade crew still working the cutout past there?" "The railroad men, I saw them from the coach when I came through, but that was near 2 weeks back." "They're still there, bigger'n before if anything. Word is they're pushing to finish the cut before winter." Silas frowned. "What's the railroad got to do with our cattle?" "Nothing," Clara said. "The railroad's got nothing to do with our cattle." And she stood there in the kitchen with her heart starting to pound because a thought had come to her. A wild thought, a reckless thought, the kind of thought her mother would have called getting above herself, and she turned it over fast, testing it, looking for the hole in it, and she couldn't find the hole. "How many men on that crew?" she asked. Silas shrugged. 203. It's a big cut. They got camps strung out for a mile. 300 men, Clara said slowly. 300 men out in the middle of nothing. 30 miles from the nearest town, working sunup to sundown in this heat. She looked at Silas. "What are they eating?" "How would I?" Silas stopped. His frown deepened. "Beans, I reckon. Hardtack. Whatever the company hauls out to 'em, which by all accounts ain't much and ain't good. I heard 2 crews quit last month over the grub. Just walked off. Said they'd sooner starve someplace prettier." The kitchen had gone very still again, but it was a different kind of stillness now. Gus had lifted his head. Caleb was staring at Clara, and Thomas had raised his face out of his hands. 300 hungry men, Clara said, with company wages in their pockets eating garbage 30 miles from anywhere, and 2 crews already quit over the food. She turned to Thomas, and her voice when it came was low and steady and absolutely certain. "Mr. Whitaker, the drought's going to take your cattle whether we fight it or not. Silas is right. There's no water for 400 head and no sense pretending there is. But you're sitting here grieving the herd when you've got 200 head down in the south pasture that you can water. 200 head of beef. And 30 miles east, there's 300 men who'd pay real money for one good meal a day. Thomas stared at her. You want to sell the railroad our cattle, he said slowly. I don't want to sell them the cattle. Clara leaned forward, both hands flat on the table. The company'll offer you slaughter price for beef on the hoof, same as the buyers always do, and slaughter price is what's killing you. No, I don't want to sell them a cow. I want to sell them supper, every day, for as long as that crew's out there. She let it land. A steer sold to a buyer is worth what he'll pay, and he'll pay next to nothing because he knows you're desperate. But that same steer, butchered and cooked and served hot to a hungry man who's got wages and no choices, Mr. Whitaker, that steer's worth 10 times over. Maybe 20. I've done the figuring in my head while I've been standing here, and I can do it on paper if you'll give me an hour, but I already know the shape of it. We don't sell the herd. We cook it. One meal at a time at a price a hungry man will pay glad, and we turn the thing that's dying into the thing that saves us. Nobody spoke. Gus Halloran was the first to break it. The old cook let out a long, slow breath, and when he spoke, his cracked voice had something like wonder in it. Feed the railroad, he said. Lord, feed the whole railroad. You can't be serious. Thomas was on his feet again, but it was a different kind of standing now, not surrender, but agitation, a man arguing against a hope, because hope had hurt him before. Feed 300 men. Out of this kitchen. Clara, we've got one stove and one cook. 2 cooks. Clara nodded at Gus. His hands don't lift, but his head works fine, and there's not a thing about cooking for a crowd that man doesn't know. And I don't need to feed 300 out of this kitchen. I need to feed them out of a wagon at the cut where they already are. We haul the food to them hot. We set up at the edge of the camp at supper time, and we serve until the pot's empty, and word gets around a railroad camp faster than fire. You said yourself, 2 crews quit over the grub. Well, they didn't quit because they weren't hungry. They quit because nobody fed them like they mattered. Her voice caught just slightly on the word, because it was the same word she'd used the very first night, and she saw Thomas hear it too. I know how to feed people so they matter, Mr. Whitaker. It's the one thing on this earth I know how to do better than anybody. Let me do it big. It'll take money we don't have, Thomas said. A wagon, supplies, a second stove maybe. And if it fails, if the company won't allow it, or the men won't pay, or the food spoils on the road, we've spent what little we've got left, and we've still got a dead herd and a banknote. We can't pay only now, we're worse off because we chased a fool's dream instead of what Clara said. Instead of sitting in this kitchen watching the creek dry up and calling it fate. She hadn't raised her voice, but everyone in the room felt the edge come into it, and it stopped Thomas cold. You said it yourself, not 5 minutes ago. It's over either way. If it's over either way, Mr. Whitaker, then there's nothing left to lose by trying. The safe road ends at the same cliff as the reckless one, so we might as well take the road with a chance at the end of it, and that Clara would think later, that was the thing that turned him. Not the numbers. Thomas had heard plenty of numbers. It was the plainness of it, the way she'd taken his own despair and turned it into a reason to fight instead of a reason to quit. If it's over either way, there's nothing left to lose. A drowning man doesn't grab the rope because the rope is strong. He grabs it because he's drowning, and here was a rope. Thomas Whitaker looked around his kitchen. He looked at Gus, whose ruined hands had gripped the edge of the table. He looked at Silas, whose careful eyes were watching Clara, with an expression that was no longer skeptical at all. He looked at Caleb Dawson, 20 years old, and orphaned, and hungry for something more than food, looking at Clara, like she'd hung the sun back up in a sky that had gone dark. He looked at his wife. An hour, he said. You said you could do the figuring on paper in an hour. I can. Then do it, all of it. What we'd need, what it'd cost, what we'd make if the men bought like you think they will. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, he sat down like a partner and not a judge. "You show me numbers that hold together, Mrs. Whitaker, and I'll butcher the first steer myself." Clara was already reaching for paper. She figured for an hour, and Thomas watched her do it, and what he watched changed something in him that would not change back. Because Clara Whitaker didn't figure the way he did. Thomas figured the way most ranchers figured, cost against price, in against out, a man doing sums he half understood, and hoping the answer came out kind. Clara figured like a general. She figured how many pounds of beef a steer gave, and how many portions came off a pound, and how much a portion cost to cook, and what a hungry man would pay for it, hot. She figured freight the miles to the cut and back the wear on a wagon, the price of a second-hand stove she'd seen sitting unused behind the church. She figured spoilage and weather, and the plain fact that some days the men wouldn't buy, and some days they'd buy double. She figured the worst case where half of it went wrong, and even the worst case came out ahead of a dead herd sold at slaughter price. And then she figured the best case, and when she got to the bottom of the best case, she stopped and set down her pencil and looked at the number for a long moment before she turned the paper around and slid it across the table. Thomas looked at it. He didn't say anything for a while. "That can't be right," he said finally. "It's right. It's the best case, mind, everything going our way. The crew buying every day, no wagon breaking down, no rain washing out the road." Clara tapped the paper. "You won't get the best case. Nobody ever gets the best case. But even at half of that, Mr. Whitaker, even at a third, you don't just pay the bank. You pay the bank, and you've got money left to buy hay and haul water and carry those 200 head through the drought instead of selling them off in a panic. You come out the far side of this summer with a herd and a debt paid, and a name up and down that railroad line as the ranch that feeds a man right." She sat back. "You don't survive this drought. You beat it. And a year from now, when the next dry summer comes, you're not scared of it, because you've got a second business that doesn't need rain at all." Thomas Whitaker stared at the paper, and Clara watched the last of the drowning look leave his face for good, and something else take its place. Something she hadn't seen there before. Something she suspected he hadn't felt since the winter he lost everything. Ambition. "Silas," Thomas said without looking up, "how fast can you butcher a steer?" Silas grinned. "Faster'n you can, boss, and then quit standing there." Thomas stood, and there was a snap in it now, a purpose that ran through the whole kitchen like current through a wire. "Gus, you and Mrs. Whitaker draw up what we need. Everything. Don't leave a thing off. Caleb?" The boy nearly leapt to attention. "You ride to town and find out who owns that stove behind the church and what they'll take for it. Silas, you and I are going to the south pasture to pick out the first steer. We start cooking tomorrow. We serve at that cut day after next." He grabbed his hat off the peg. Then he stopped, hand on the door, and turned back to look at his wife one more time. "You really think you can do this?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. Clara stood up from the table. She was a large woman, and she'd spent her whole life being underestimated for it, laughed at for it, written off before she opened her mouth. And she looked her husband dead in the eye, and she gave him the truest answer she had. "I've been doing this my whole life, Mr. Whitaker," she said. "Feeding people who didn't expect much from me and watching their faces change. The only thing that's different now is the size of the table." She reached for her apron. "Now go pick me out a steer, and pick a good one. First impressions matter, and I intend to make one those railroad men won't forget." Thomas Whitaker looked at her for one more second. Then he did the thing he had not done since the day she arrived, the thing Gus and Silas and young Caleb all saw, and none of them ever forgot. He smiled at her. A real smile, wide and unguarded, and years younger than the tired face he'd worn all summer. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas said, and he was gone out the door with Silas at his heels hollering for the branding knives, and the whole ranch came alive around a plan that had been an hour before only a wild thought in a large woman's head. They worked through the night and into the next day. Clara had never worked so hard in her life, and she had worked hard her whole life. She and Gus butchered and boned and salted the old man's crooked hands, unable to grip a knife, but able to point, to instruct, to remember 1,000 tricks about cooking beef for a crowd that Clara soaked up like a dry field soaks rain. They built a marinade out of molasses and vinegar, and the last of the good coffee, because Gus swore by coffee in a beef marinade, and Clara had never heard of such a thing, and it turned out to be the best thing she'd ever tasted. They baked bread until the stove couldn't take another loaf, and then they baked more. They cooked beans by the bushel. They loaded the wagon Caleb had gotten the church stove for a song, and they'd lashed it into the wagon bed and figured out how to fire it on the road, and they loaded it until the axles groaned. And through all of it, Clara felt something she had not let herself feel in a long time. She felt like this was what she'd been made for. Not for the small kitchens she'd cooked in, before taking orders, keeping her head down, being told she was lucky to have the work. For this. For the bigness of it, the risk of it, the wild reaching past what anybody thought possible of it. She'd spent 27 years being told to want less, to be less, to shrink herself to fit the small space the world allowed a woman like her. And here she was, refusing to shrink anything at all. Not her body, not her ambition, not the size of the table she meant to set. Let them line up, she thought, lashing down the last of the bread. Let all 300 of them line up. They set out for the cut before dawn on the second day. Thomas drove. Clara sat beside him with Gus wedged in behind, and Silas and Caleb rode alongside on horseback, and the wagon full of food creaked and swayed down the road toward the railroad camp, as the brassy sky went pink and then gold with a sunrise that promised another blistering rainless day. Nobody talked much. There was too much riding on it. Clara ran through it all one more time in her head. The timing, the fire, the serving, the price she'd settled on low enough that a working man wouldn't balk high enough to save them all. And she found her hands were shaking just slightly, and she pressed them flat against her knees. Thomas noticed. Of course he noticed. He'd started noticing everything about her the way she'd noticed everything about the ranch. "Scared?" he asked. "Terrified," Clara admitted. "Good." Thomas flicked the reins. "Man who told me he wasn't scared before something this size, I wouldn't trust him to drive a nail." He glanced at her. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Whitaker, if this goes bad, it goes bad on my say-so as much as yours. I signed off on it. I picked the steer. Whatever happens out there, we're in it the same." Clara looked at him. It was, she realized, the first thing he'd said to her that sounded like a husband. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker," she said quietly. And then the road crested a low rise, and the railroad cut spread out below them, a raw gash in the earth a mile long, swarming with men, dust and noise, and the ring of steel on rock, hundreds of them, more than Clara had let herself picture, a whole small city of hungry men, laboring in the heat. And her breath caught, and her heart slammed, and for one terrible second, the wild thought looked like exactly what her mother would have called it, getting above herself. Foolishness. A fat girl off a stagecoach thinking she could feed an army. Then Thomas's hand closed over hers on the wagon seat, just for a moment, warm and rough and certain. "Set your table, Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Let's go show 'em what supper's supposed to be." Clara Whitaker took a breath, and she climbed down off that wagon into the dust and the noise and the staring hungry crowd, and she started to cook. The first man who wandered over was thin and sunburned and suspicious, drawn by the smell the way the ranch hands had been drawn that first night, and he stood at the edge of the wagon watching Clara work the church stove with a scowl on his face. "How much?" he said. Clara told him the price. He snorted. "For what beans and hardtack, we get that free from the company, and it ain't worth free." "It's not beans and hardtack." Clara didn't stop working. She lifted the lid off the pot, and the smell of the coffee and molasses beef rolled out into the camp, and the thin man's scowl faltered. "It's brisket slow cooked since yesterday, fresh bread baked this morning, beans with real pork in them, and coffee that won't taste like the bottom of a boot." She looked up at him. "First plate's on me. You eat it, and if it's not the best meal you've had since you signed on with this railroad, you keep your money, and you tell every man here I'm a liar. Fair." The thin man narrowed his eyes. But he was hungry, and free was free, and he held out a tin plate. Clara filled it. She filled it high, too high, more than the price warranted, because Gus had taught her that a hungry man's first look at a plate is the whole sale, and she wanted this first man's first look to stop his breath. She piled on the brisket and ladled the beans and set 2 thick slices of bread on the side, and she handed it across, and the thin, sunburned man took it and looked down at it, and Clara watched the scowl slide right off his face. He ate. He ate the way the ranch hands had eaten that first night, the eyes closing, the shoulders dropping, the whole hard-bitten wariness of him melting away over a tin plate of hot food. He ate a forkful of brisket and stopped chewing and just stood there for a second with his eyes shut like a man in church. Then he turned around, plate in hand, and hollered at the top of his lungs across the whole railroad cut. "Boys!" he bellowed. "Boys, get over here! You ain't gonna believe this!" And they came. They came the way hungry men come, loud, dragging their boots, doubtful, drawn by the smell and the shouting, and the sight of one of their own standing there eating with his eyes shut in bliss. They came in 2s and 3s, and then in a flood, wiping their hands on their trousers, digging in their pockets for coins, forming a line that stretched back from the wagon and grew and grew and grew until Clara couldn't see the end of it. 300 men lined up for her food. And Clara Bennett Whitaker, the woman they'd laughed at in the yard, the church social, the mistake the mail-order bride nobody wanted, stood at her stove in the dust and the heat with her sleeves rolled up and her heart pounding fit to burst, and she started to fill plates one after another, faster than she'd ever filled a plate in her life, and every single man who took one looked down at it with the same astonished face, and not one of them, not one walked away, disappointed. Behind her, Thomas Whitaker stood beside the wagon and watched the line stretch past 100 men, past 200, and watched his wife feed every one of them like they mattered, and watched the money pile up in the coffee tin they'd set out for it, and he could not speak. He couldn't speak because his throat had closed. He was watching a miracle. He knew it for what it was. 2 days ago he'd sat in his kitchen with his head in his hands, certain the drought had killed him, certain the letter that brought Clara had been the last mistake of a ruined man. And now he stood in the dust of a railroad cut and watched 300 strangers line up to be fed by the woman he'd been ashamed to call his wife, and the shame he felt now was of an entirely different kind. It was the shame of a man who'd looked at gold and called it dross. Gus Halloran shuffled up beside him, wiping his crooked hands on a rag, his old face wet and shining. "Would you look at that?" Gus said softly. "Would you just look at that?" "I'm looking," Thomas said. His voice came out strange. "Eleanor could cook, Tom. God rest her, she could cook a fine Sunday supper, and I'll not say a word against it." Gus watched the line. "But Eleanor never done this. Nobody's ever done this. That woman right there," he shook his head slowly. "You didn't marry a cook, Tom. You married a force of nature, and you spent 2 weeks too blind with grief to see it." Thomas didn't answer. He was watching Clara laugh at something a railroad man had said, really laugh her whole face open with it, flour on her sleeves and joy in her eyes. And he was thinking about the morning she'd arrived and the way he'd looked at her and seen only disappointment, only proof that Eleanor was gone, only a bill come due. He'd been wrong about everything. He'd been so wrong. The line stretched on into the gold morning, and Clara filled the plates, and the coffee tin grew heavy with coins, and somewhere in the middle of it, she never could say exactly when Clara Whitaker stopped being afraid. She stopped being afraid because a thing she'd known her whole life had finally out here in the dust, with 300 hungry strangers, been proven true in front of the whole world. She could feed people. She could feed anybody. She could feed an army out of a wagon in the middle of nowhere and send every last one of them away glad. And no amount of laughing, no church social joke, no cruel first look from a stranger's eyes could ever take that away from her again. They served until the pots scraped empty, and there were still men in the line when the food ran out, and Clara stood up on the wagon seat where they could all see her and made them a promise in a voice that carried the length of the cut. "We ran short today," she called. "That's my fault, and it won't happen twice. You come back tomorrow, same time, and there'll be enough for every last man of you and seconds besides. You have my word on it. and 300 railroad men, most of whom had never in their lives been promised a good meal by anybody, sent up a cheer that rolled down the mile-long cut and echoed off the raw stone walls of it. And Clara Whitaker stood on that wagon seat with her arms spread and let it wash over her. On the ride home, the empty pots rattling, and the coffee tin heavy in her lap, Clara counted the money. She counted it twice because the first time she didn't believe it. Then she turned to Thomas, who was driving with a look on his face like a man who'd woken from a long bad dream, and she told him the number. Thomas pulled the wagon to a dead stop in the middle of the road. He turned and looked at the coffee tin. He looked at Clara. He looked back at the tin. "In one day," he said. "In one afternoon," Clara said. "That's one afternoon, Mr. Whitaker, at the low price, and we ran out before we'd even served them all. Tomorrow we bring more. And the day after that, more still." She set her hand on the tin, on the weight of it, on the proof of it. The drought was going to take everything, and instead, her voice wavered, and she let it because some things earn a wavering voice. Instead, it's going to make us. Thomas Whitaker looked at his wife for a long moment in the gold light of that rainless evening. Then he took off his hat and he held it against his chest, and he said the thing he'd been unable to say since the morning she stepped down off the stagecoach, and he looked at her and saw only what he'd lost. "I owe you an apology," Thomas said. "The day you came, I looked at you and I thought, God forgive me. I thought the letter had cheated me. I thought I'd sent away for help and gotten a burden. I couldn't hardly stand to look at you, and it wasn't your fault. None of it was ever your fault. It was mine. All mine, grief and pride and a blindness I had no business carrying." His voice broke. "You saved my ranch. You saved my men. You've saved me near about, and I spent 2 weeks too ashamed of the size of you to see the size of you. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? I looked at the best thing that ever came into my life, and I was ashamed of it, and I'm sorry. I am so deeply sorry, and I don't expect you to forgive it, but I needed you to hear it said." The road was quiet. The empty pots had stopped rattling. Somewhere off in the brown grass, a meadowlark called the same as it had on the ride to town a lifetime ago when he'd told her to let him do the talking. Clara Whitaker looked at her husband at the tears standing in the eyes of the proud, hard man who'd been so sure she was a mistake, and she felt something in her chest that she had waited her whole life to feel and had almost stopped believing she ever would. She felt seen. "There's nothing to forgive Thomas," she said. And it was the first time she'd called him by his name. He heard it. She watched him hear it. And Thomas Whitaker put his hat back on his head and picked up the reins with hands that weren't quite steady. And he turned the wagon toward home, under a sky that still would not rain. And neither of them said another word the whole way back, because some silences are empty, and some silences are full, and this one was so full there wasn't any room left in it for words. The ranch was waiting when they rolled in. Every hand had stayed up. They'd heard somehow word travels on a ranch faster than it travels anywhere, and they were gathered in the yard in the last of the light, and when the wagon came into view, Caleb Dawson let out a whoop, and the whole crowd of them surged forward, and Clara climbed down off that wagon into a knot of cheering, grinning, hollering ranch hands, who a few weeks before had laughed at her in this very yard, and now looked at her like she'd hung the moon. Bristol was there. Bristol the drifter, the one who'd made the church social joke that first morning. He hung back at the edge of the crowd, while the others crowded Clara, and he waited, and when the noise died down a little, he stepped forward, turning his hat around and around in his hands, and he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "Ma'am," he said, "I got to say a thing." "Say it, Bristol." "That first day, in the yard. What I said about—" He swallowed. "The church social. I'm ashamed of it. I've been ashamed of it for a while now, ever since you started saving me the crusty heel, like you knew I favored it, which I never told you, so you must have just noticed, and nobody ever—" His voice thickened, and he stopped and started over. "Nobody ever noticed a thing about me in my whole life, ma'am. Not one thing. And you noticed which end of the bread I liked inside of 3 days. I don't know what to do with that. But I know I got no business making jokes about a woman like you, and I'm sorry, And if any man on this ranch or off it ever says a word against you in my hearing, I'll put him in the dirt. That's a promise from Bristol for whatever a drifter's promise is worth. Clara looked at the hard, scared, ashamed face of the man who'd laughed at her first, and she felt no triumph in it. She felt only the old, deep tenderness she'd always felt for people the world had taught to expect nothing. A drifter's promise is worth exactly as much as any other man's Bristol, she said. And I'll take it, and I thank you for it. Now come here and eat. There's a plate of brisket I saved back special, and I saved you the crustiest heel in the whole batch. Bristol's face crumpled just for a second before he got it back under control, and the whole ranch ate that night in the yard under the first stars. The drought forgotten for an evening. The banknote forgotten everything. Forgotten but the food and the light, and the impossible wonderful thing that had happened out at the railroad cut, and at the head of it all sat Clara Whitaker, the woman everyone had underestimated, watching the people she'd fed laugh and eat and shine, and knowing finally all the way to the bottom of her that she had found the place where she belonged. Thomas sat beside her, not across from her, beside her, and when she caught him watching her instead of eating, he didn't look away the way a man does when he's been caught. He held her eyes steady and warm and unashamed, and he lifted his coffee cup to her just slightly, a small private toast in the middle of the noise, and Clara understood everything he meant by it and lifted her cup back. The drought would go on. The creek would stay dry and the summer would stay cruel, and there was work ahead of them, harder than anything they'd yet done. But they would go out to that cut tomorrow and the day after, and they would feed 300 men, and then more than 300, and the coffee tin would fill, and the Whitaker Ranch would not only survive, it would rise. Clara Whitaker had come to Montana with 2 leather bags and a marriage certificate, and a body the whole world had taught her to apologize for. She had never once apologized. And now, sitting in a yard full of people who loved her, beside a husband who had finally learned to see her, she knew she never would. For 3 weeks, it worked like a dream. Every morning before dawn, the wagon rolled east toward the cut loaded heavier than the day before, and every evening it rolled home with the coffee tin so full Clara had taken to burying it under a sack of flour, so no one on the road would guess what they carried. The railroad men had a name for her now. They called her the Angel of the Cut, and they didn't say it soft or mocking. They said it the way men say a thing they mean, and when Clara's wagon crested the rise each morning, a shout went up the length of the camp that could be heard a half-mile off. She had gone from a joke in a ranch yard to a legend along 30 miles of railroad line in less time than it took the grass to turn brown. And the money came in. Thomas paid down the banknote first. He rode into town on a Tuesday and laid the cash on the counter in front of the same clerk who'd looked at him with pity all summer, and he watched the man count it twice and go pale, and he said nothing. Just took his receipt and tipped his hat and walked out into the street, a man who breathed easier than he had in a year. Then he bought hay. Then he arranged to haul water for the south pasture herd, the 200 head they'd chosen to save, and they came through the worst of the drought, fat and healthy, while other ranches all across the territory were selling off their cattle at ruinous prices or watching them die in the dust. The Whitaker Ranch didn't just survive. It thrived in a summer that ruined half the county. And that Clara would come to understand was exactly the problem, because when a man's ranch is dying, nobody envies him. But when a man's ranch is the only green thing in a brown summer, when word gets around that Thomas Whitaker paid off his note and bought hay and came through the drought richer than he went in, all on the strength of a wagon full of food and a wife who could cook, then a different kind of attention turns your way. The first sign of it came from Cyrus Bledsoe. He rode out to the ranch on a fine afternoon, all smiles, his pink face shining, and he found Clara in the yard, supervising the loading of the next day's supplies. He climbed down off his horse with the careful cheer of a man who'd rehearsed his lines. "Mrs. Whitaker." He swept off his hat. "The famous Mrs. Whitaker. I declare you're the talk of 3 counties, the angel of the cut. My. Mr. Bledsoe." Clara didn't stop counting sacks. "What can I do for you? I've come with a proposition, a business proposition from one shrewd mind to another." He tucked his thumbs into his vest. You're buying a great deal of supply these days. Flour, beans, coffee, and all of it through me, which I'm grateful for truly. But you're paying Bighorn's price plus a dime as we agreed. And I got to thinking, a woman with your volume, your reputation, you shouldn't be buying retail at all. You should have a partner. Someone who knows the supply trade, who can get you goods at wholesale, who can handle the ordering and the freight, so you can focus on the cooking. He smiled his half-second early smile. I'm proposing we go into business together, Mrs. Whitaker. Bledsoe and Whitaker. I supply, you cook, we split the— No, Clara said. Bledsoe blinked. You haven't heard the terms. I don't need to. Clara set down her tally book and turned to face him fully. Mr. Bledsoe, 6 weeks ago, you were robbing my husband blind because you thought a grieving man wouldn't check your arithmetic. Now I've made this ranch worth something, and here you are, hat in hand, wanting to be my partner. I'll tell you what I told myself the day I read those wrappers. A man shows you who he is. You'd be a fool not to believe him. You showed me who you are. I believe you. She picked the tally book back up. I'll keep buying my flour from you at the price we agreed, because it's fair and it's convenient. But partners, no. I'd sooner partner with a rattlesnake. At least a rattlesnake rattles before it strikes. Bledsoe's smile curdled. You're making a mistake, he said, and the cheer had gone out of his voice entirely. A woman in business needs friends, needs protection. It's a hard world for a woman alone, Mrs. Whitaker, and harder still for a woman who— His eyes flicked over her the old cruel arithmetic, and he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. For a woman who— What, Mr. Bledsoe? Clara said quietly. Go on, say it. You won't be the first. He didn't say it. He was a coward, and cowards only say the cruel thing when they think it's safe. He jammed his hat back on his head and climbed onto his horse. You'll come around, he said. When the shine wears off and you find out how many enemies a successful woman makes, you'll wish you'd taken a friend when one was offered. He rode off, and Clara watched him go, and she felt the first cold breath of something she'd been too busy and too happy to see coming. She'd made herself valuable. And valuable things she knew from a hard life are things people try to take. She didn't tell Thomas about Bledsoe's visit right away. She meant to. But that evening, a rider came up the road at a gallop, and the news he carried pushed everything else clean out of her head. He was a young man in a good suit, gone dusty from hard riding, and he swung down in the yard and asked for Thomas Whitaker by name. And when Thomas came out of the barn, the young man handed him a letter sealed with wax and stood back to wait while he read it. Thomas read it once. Then he read it again. Then he looked up and his face had gone strange. It's from the railroad, he said. The company, the Northern Pacific. What do they want? Clara asked. They want— Thomas looked down at the letter. They want to meet with us. With you. There's a man coming, Mr. Harlan Crane, a purchasing agent for the whole Western Division. He's heard about the operation at the cut. He's coming to make us an offer. Thomas handed her the letter, and his hand wasn't quite steady. A contract, Clara. A company contract, to feed their crews. Not just this cut, all of them. Every camp on the Western line. Clara took the letter and read it, and her heart began to pound. Every camp on the Western line. Not 300 men. Thousands. A contract with the Northern Pacific Railroad, one of the biggest companies in the whole country, guaranteed money, guaranteed volume. The kind of business that didn't just save a ranch, but built a fortune, built a name, built something that would outlast all of them. It was everything she'd dreamed of, and more than she'd dared dream. And that was exactly why the cold breath she'd felt after Bledsoe came back twice as strong. When does he come? She asked. Friday, said the young man in the dusty suit. Mr. Crane will arrive Friday, and he asked me to tell you he does not like to be kept waiting, and he does not like to be disappointed. The young man hesitated, then added lower, like he was doing them a kindness. He's a hard man, ma'am. I've watched him do these deals up and down the line. He comes in friendly, and he leaves you signing something you didn't understand. If you take my advice, and I'll deny I gave it, You'll read every word twice before you put your name to anything." Then he tipped his hat, climbed back on his horse, and rode off into the dusk. Clara stood in the yard with the letter in her hand, and Thomas came and stood beside her, and for a while, neither of them spoke. "This is it," Thomas said finally. "This is the thing that changes everything. A company contract. Clara, we'd never have to worry about the drought again, or the cattle prices, or the bank, or any of it. We'd be set. Our children would be set if we—" He stopped and cleared his throat because he'd said a thing neither of them had said before, and the word children hung in the air between them, and Clara felt her face go warm. "If we're careful," Clara said, letting him off the hook of the word. "That young man was trying to warn us, Thomas. A hard man coming in friendly, leaving us signing something we don't understand. I've met that kind of man before. Not in railroads and kitchens in the towns I cooked in every place a person tried to get my labor cheap and my signature cheaper. Harlan Crane's not coming here to make us rich. He's coming here to make the railroad rich off of us, and to do it so smooth, we'll thank him while he does it." "Then we don't sign." "Then we don't sign a bad deal," Clara corrected. "But we don't walk away from a good one either, out of fear. That's the trap, Thomas. A man like Crane, half his power is that he makes you so scared of being cheated that you either sign anything or you run. We're going to do neither. We're going to sit across that table from him, and we're going to be the two most prepared people he's ever tried to fast talk in his life." She folded the letter. "How long till Friday?" "3 days. Then I've got 3 days of figuring to do." Clara's mind was already moving, already running the numbers, already 3 steps down a road Harlan Crane didn't know she could see. "Because when that man sits down across from me, I intend to know his business better than he does." She spent those 3 days the way she'd spent the hour that saved the ranch head, down pencil moving, missing nothing. She figured what it cost to feed a man for a day, and what the railroad was almost certainly paying now, camp by camp, for the garbage that made crews quit. She figured freight and spoilage and the price of scaling up more wagons, more stoves, more cooks, a whole operation 10 times the size of the one she was running. She figured what she'd need to charge to make it worth doing, and what Crane would want to pay to make it worth signing. And she figured the wide gap between those two numbers, because that gap was where the whole negotiation would live, and she meant to know every inch of it before she sat down. And she figured one thing more. The thing that mattered most. The thing a hard man like Crane would never expect a plus-size ranch wife to have figured at all. She figured what she was worth to him. Not what the food was worth. What she was worth. Because the railroad didn't need brisket, the railroad could buy brisket anywhere. What the railroad needed was crews that didn't quit, and crews quit over food, and there was exactly one person in the whole territory who had proven she could turn a mutinous, half-starved railroad camp into 300 men who cheered when her wagon crested the rise. That was the thing Crane was really coming to buy, and Clara intended to make sure he paid for it. Gus helped. The old man had cooked for railroad crews himself 30 years back, and he knew things about company contracts that Clara wrote down word for word. "They'll offer you a price per man per day," Gus told her, "and it'll sound fine till you figure they mean to tell you how many men and change the number whenever it suits them. You make 'em guarantee the count, or you'll be cooking for 500 and getting paid for 3. And they'll want you to buy your supply through the company store. Don't. That's Bledsoe's trick, wearing a bigger hat. You keep your own supply, or they'll skim you coming and going." Clara wrote it all down. She wrote until her hand cramped, and then she switched hands and wrote more. Silas helped too in his quiet way. On the second evening, he found her at the kitchen table buried in figures, and he set down a cup of coffee at her elbow and stood there a moment. "You're going to be all right with this, Crane fella," he said. "You sound sure. I am sure." Silas leaned against the doorframe. "I watched you take Bledsoe apart in his own store without raising your voice. I've been reading men my whole life, ma'am. It's half of what a foreman does, and I'll tell you what I read in you. You don't scare. Folks think you're gentle 'cause you're kind, and they figure kind means soft, and they're wrong, and they don't find out they're wrong till it's too late to matter." He almost smiled. Crane's gonna walk in here Friday figuring he's got the easy end of the table. That's his mistake to make. I wouldn't trade places with him for money. Clara looked up at the careful, dark-eyed foreman who'd told her that first week he'd wait and see what she was before he decided. "You've decided then," she said. "I decided a while back, ma'am." Silas pushed off the doorframe. "Decided the first time I watched you save Bristol the crusty heel. A person shows you who they are, you'd be a fool not to believe 'em. Ain't that what you told Bledsoe?" He tipped his hat. "Well, you showed me. Get some sleep. You'll want your wits Friday." Friday came. Harlan Crane arrived at noon in a black buggy with a driver and a clerk, and he was exactly what Clara had pictured. And worse, a lean, silver-haired man with a warm smile and cold eyes, dressed in a suit that cost more than the Whitaker Ranch made in a season. And he came up the yard with his hand already out and his voice already flowing. Mrs. Whitaker, the angel of the cut herself. He took her hand in both of his and held it a beat too long. "I have heard such things. Such things. Grown men weeping over your brisket. Crews that wouldn't work for any wage suddenly happy as clams. You have a gift, ma'am, a true gift, and the Northern Pacific would be honored to put it to good use. And Mr. Whitaker." He shook Thomas's hand. "A lucky man. A very lucky man." "Won't you come in, Mr. Crane?" Clara said. "I've made coffee." He came in. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Clara had read the ledger that first morning, where she'd shown Thomas the wrappers, where she'd figured the plan that saved them all. His clerk sat beside him with a leather folio. And Harlan Crane spread his warm smile across the table, and began exactly as the young writer had warned to be friendly. He was good. Clara had to give him that. He praised the coffee. He praised the ranch. He asked after the cattle and listened to the answer like it was the most fascinating thing he'd ever heard. He drew Thomas out about the drought and clucked in sympathy and told a story about a ranch he'd seen go under in Kansas. A sad story, a story that landed in the room like a quiet threat. See how easily it all falls apart. And then, when the warmth had filled the kitchen and Thomas had started to relax, Harlan Crane slid the folio across the table and got down to business. "Now, the company's prepared to offer you a contract," he said, "to provision our crews along the Western Division. It's a generous offer, Mrs. Whitaker, more generous than we've made anyone, and I'll tell you frankly, it's on the strength of your reputation. We're offering you a set price per man per day, for as many camps as you can supply." He named the price, and Clara, who had spent 3 days figuring exactly this moment, kept her face perfectly still, because the price was low. Not insultingly low. Crane was too clever for that. It was low the way a thing is low when it sounds fine, until you do the arithmetic low enough that Clara would clear a little profit and be grateful for it, and never realize how much more the work was worth. It was Bledsoe's trick, wearing a bigger hat, exactly as Gus had said. "That's a fair-sounding number," Clara said. Crane smiled. "It's a very fair number. It sounds fair. Let me make sure I understand it." Clara pulled her own papers toward her unhurried. "That's per man per day. And how many men would you be guaranteeing me, Mr. Crane?" The smile flickered just slightly. "Well, that varies. Camps grow and shrink. We couldn't guarantee an exact—" "Then we've got a problem right there," Clara said pleasantly, "because I can't buy supply for a number that varies. If I lay in beef and flour for 1,000 men and you send me 800, I've spent money I can't get back. And if I lay in for 800 and you send me 12, I've got 400 men in a railroad camp who don't get fed, and I've watched what a railroad camp does when it doesn't get fed, Mr. Crane. 2 crews walked off this very line last month over exactly that. So, if you want me feeding your men, you'll guarantee me the count camp by camp in writing 30 days ahead. I'll cook for whatever number you name, but you'll name it and you'll stand behind it." Crane's cold eyes had sharpened. The clerk had stopped writing. "That's an unusual demand," Crane said. "It's a sensible demand. You're a sensible man. You'll see the sense in it." Clara didn't blink. "Next, supply." I'll want it understood that I purchase my own supply through my own sources at my own discretion. I won't be buying through the company store. The company store offers a way to charge me for my flour and pay me for my cooking and skim the difference twice. Clara said, still pleasant, still even. And I've already been robbed by one man who thought I wouldn't check his arithmetic. I check everybody's arithmetic now. Mr. Crane, it's a habit that served me well. I buy my own supply or we don't have a deal. The kitchen had gone very quiet. Thomas was watching his wife with something close to awe. Harlan Crane was watching her with something else entirely, a slow reassessing attention, the look of a hunter who'd walked into a clearing expecting a rabbit and found something with teeth. You've thought about this, Crane said slowly. I think about everything, Mr. Crane. It's the only thing I've ever been good at that people don't expect me to be. Clara set her hand flat on her papers. And now, let's talk about the price. Because the number you named is the number a man names when he thinks the person across the table is grateful just to be asked. And I want to be clear about something before we go further. She leaned forward just slightly. You didn't ride out here because the Northern Pacific is short on beef. You can buy beef anywhere. You rode out here because your crews quit all up and down this line, and every crew that quits costs you more than a season of my cooking. You've got a railroad to finish before winter, and men who won't finish it on the slop, you're feeding them. And word reached you that there's a woman in Montana Territory who took the worst-fed, most mutinous cut on your whole division and turned it into 300 men who cheer when they see her wagon. That's what you came to buy, Mr. Crane. Not brisket. That. And that's worth a good deal more than the number you named. For a long moment, Harlan Crane said nothing at all. Then slowly, he began to smile, a different smile than the warm one he'd walked in with. This one reached his eyes. This one was almost respect. Mrs. Whitaker, he said, I have been buying and selling the labor of men and women up and down this railroad for 11 years. And I don't believe anyone has ever taken me apart at my own game quite so thoroughly or quite so politely. He sat back. May I ask you something straight? Please, where does a ranch wife learn to negotiate like a Chicago lawyer? And here it came, the thing Clara had known would come, the moment when a man like Crane looked at her and let the surprise show, the moment that had a cruel edge to it, even when the man meant it kind. Because underneath the question was the thing nobody ever said, but everybody thought, how does a woman like you, a large woman, a plain woman, a woman off a stagecoach with 2 bags to her name, how do you know things? Clara had been asked a version of that question her whole life. She had an answer ready. I learned it, she said, in every kitchen that ever paid me less than a man for the same work and told me I was lucky to have it. I learned it from every merchant who quoted me a high price because he took one look at me and figured I'd be too grateful or too ashamed to argue. I learned it, Mr. Crane, from a lifetime of people looking at the size of me and deciding I must be simple, must be soft, must be easy, and finding out one at a time that they were wrong. She held his cold eyes with her steady ones. Every person who ever underestimated me was a teacher. I've had more teachers than a schoolhouse, and you were about to be one more until I decided I'd rather you were a partner. The kitchen was silent, and then Harlan Crane did a thing Thomas Whitaker would tell and retell for the rest of his life. The hardest negotiator on the Western Division of the Northern Pacific Railroad put back his silver head and laughed a real laugh, delighted and surprised, the laugh of a man who has spent so long winning that being beaten had become a novelty he could actually enjoy. Marcus, he said to his clerk, still chuckling, put the folio away. That offer's dead. We're going to write a new one. He looked at Clara, and the cold had gone out of his eyes entirely. A real one. Mrs. Whitaker, you name your terms. The Count guaranteed 30 days out your own supply and a price that reflects, what did you call it, the thing I actually came to buy. You tell me your number. I suspect it'll be high. I suspect I'll pay it anyway, because I've just watched you work, and a woman who can do to Harlan Crane what you've done in 20 minutes can damn well keep 3,000 railroad men from walking off my line. Clara named her number. It was high. Crane paid it. They spent the rest of the afternoon at that kitchen table, hammering out the terms, and Clara caught 2 more tricks buried in the clerk's fine handwriting and pulled them out by the root. And by the time the sun was low, Harlan Crane signed a contract that was fair, truly fair. Fair in a way. Clara had made it be through 3 days of figuring and 20 years of being underestimated, and he signed it with a flourish and shook her hand, and this time he didn't hold it too long. He held it like a man shaking hands with an equal. "You'll do well," he told her, gathering his hat. "You'll do better than well. And when you're the biggest provisioning outfit in the territory, which you will be, Mrs. Whitaker, mark me. I hope you'll remember that Harlan Crane was smart enough to pay your price instead of fool enough to lowball you twice." He set his hat on his head. "Most men would have. That's the difference between us and the Bledsoes of the world. We know a good thing when it beats us at our own table." He climbed into his black buggy and rode off, and the moment the buggy was out of sight, the kitchen erupted. Gus let out a whoop that startled the dogs. Caleb, who'd been listening at the window the whole time and thought nobody knew, came tumbling in the door hollering. Silas leaned in the doorway, shaking his head slow, with a grin splitting his careful face, and he caught Clara's eye and said just loud enough, "Told you. Wouldn't trade places with him for money." And Thomas crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took his wife's face in both his rough hands and looked at her like he was seeing something holy, and then he kissed her right there in front of Gus and Caleb and Silas and God and everybody, the first time he'd ever kissed her, and the whole kitchen went up in cheers. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. "Do you have any idea," he said low, just for her, "any idea at all, what you just did, what you are?" "I made us a fair deal," Clara said, but her voice was shaking. "You made us a fortune. You made us a name." Thomas shook his head, his hands still framing her face. "The day you stepped off that coach, I looked at you and I thought God had sent me a burden to punish me for something. And instead," his voice broke clean in half, "instead, he sent me the best partner, the finest mind, the biggest heart, and the bravest soul I have ever known in my life. And I nearly sent her back because I was too much of a coward and a fool to see past." He couldn't finish it. "Say it, Thomas," Clara said softly. "You keep starting and stopping. Say the whole thing once, and then we'll never need to say it again." Thomas Whitaker took a breath. "Past your body," he said. "I nearly sent away the best thing that ever happened to me because I was ashamed of how you looked. Because I thought men would laugh. Because I let their eyes matter more than my own good sense. And I have never in my life been so wrong about anything, or so ashamed of being wrong. And I'll spend the rest of my days making sure you never doubt for one single minute that I know exactly what I've got." He pressed his forehead to hers. "You're the whole ranch, Clara. You're the whole ranch and everything on it. You always were. I was just too blind to see it." Shul. And Clara Whitaker, who had come to Montana, braced for a lifetime of being tolerated, stood in a kitchen full of cheering people, with her husband's forehead against hers, and the biggest railroad contract in the territory, drying its ink on the table beside them. And she let herself cry, really cry, for the first time since she'd arrived. Not from sorrow, but from the sheer overflowing weight of being at last completely and unmistakably seen. That should have been the happiest night of her life, and for a few hours it was. They celebrated late. Clara cooked a supper fit for the occasion, and the whole ranch ate together in the yard again, and there were toasts, and Gus told stories about the old railroad days, and Caleb got into the hard cider and had to be walked to the bunkhouse by a laughing Silas, and Thomas sat beside his wife, with his arm around her the whole night, and didn't care who saw. The stars came out. The drought-dry air was warm. And for one golden evening, everything Clara had built stood whole and shining and safe. Then, near midnight, when the fires had burned low and the last of the hands had drifted off to their bunks, a rider came up the road. Clara saw him first, a shape against the dark, moving slow and careful, not the gallop of good news. She touched Thomas's arm, and he followed her gaze and got to his feet, and they waited in the dying firelight as the rider came into the yard and stopped. It was the young man in the good suit, the one who'd brought the railroad's first letter, the one who'd warned them about Crane. But he wasn't dusty cheerful now. He was gray-faced and grim, and he didn't get down off his horse. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Whitaker, I'm sorry to come so late. I rode hard to get ahead of it." He swallowed. "Ahead of the news." "What news?" Thomas said. The young man looked at the contract Clara had signed just hours before. She'd brought it out to the yard to show it off. It was sitting right there on the table among the supper plates, and something like grief crossed his face. "There's going to be trouble with that contract," he said quietly. "Bad trouble, and it's coming faster than you know. Mr. Crane doesn't know yet. He signed in good faith, I'll swear to that. But by the time he finds out, it may already be too late for all of you." He glanced back over his shoulder toward the dark road, like he feared he'd been followed. "I shouldn't be here. If they knew I'd warned you, I'd lose more than my job. But you fed those men when the company wouldn't, ma'am, and I won't stand by and watch what's about to happen to you without at least giving you the chance to get ahead of it." Clara stood up slowly, the joy of the evening draining out of her that cold breath she'd felt after Bledsoe, the one she'd been too busy and too happy to heed, rushing back now full and freezing. "Get down off that horse," she said, "and tell me everything. From the beginning. And don't you leave out a single word." The young man got down off his horse. His name was Daniel Hirsch, he told them, and he was a junior clerk in the railroad's regional office, and what he'd come to say was this. Harlan Crane had signed Clara's contract in good faith, but Harlan Crane didn't own the Western Division. He answered to a board of directors back in St. Paul, and the man who ran that board was named Augustus Thorne, and Augustus Thorne had a nephew. "His name's Pruitt," Daniel said. He was sitting at the kitchen table, now the celebration cleared away, his hat in his hands, Clara and Thomas across from him, and Silas standing grim in the doorway where he'd appeared the moment he saw the rider come in. Leland Pruitt. And for the past 2 years the company's provisioning contracts on the Western Line have gone through a supply outfit that Pruitt owns. Owns quiet. His name's not on it. It's all done through a front man, a fella named Hobbs, but it's Pruitt's, and everybody in the office knows it, and nobody says it out loud, because Pruitt's uncle signs the paychecks. Clara felt the cold settle into her all the way through. "So when I signed a contract to provision the Western Line," she said slowly, "I took the money straight out of Leland Pruitt's pocket." "Yes, ma'am." "And Leland Pruitt is the nephew of the man who runs the whole railroad." "Yes, ma'am." Daniel turned his hat around and around. "Mr. Crane, he doesn't answer to Pruitt directly. Crane's a purchasing agent. He goes where the good deals are, and you were a good deal, the best he'd seen in years. So he signed you. But when word gets back to St. Paul that the Western provisioning contract went to some ranch wife in Montana instead of through Pruitt's outfit," he shook his head. "Ma'am, Pruitt's been skimming that contract for 2 years. Feeding the men garbage and pocketing the difference. That's why the food's so bad. That's why crews quit. It was never that the company was cheap. It's that Pruitt was stealing, and the men ate the difference." He looked up, and his young face was miserable. "You didn't just win a contract, you exposed him. The minute your food shows up, and it's good, and it's honest, and it costs what it ought to, every man on that board is going to ask the same question. Why was the old food so bad and so dear? And that question leads straight to Leland Pruitt. So Pruitt can't let your contract stand. He can't. If your operation succeeds, it proves he's a thief. He's got to make you fail, and he's got to make you fail fast before the first honest meal ever gets served under that contract." The kitchen was dead silent. Then Thomas Whitaker stood up so hard his chair went over backward. "Then we fight him," he said. "We've got a signed contract. Crane signed it. It's legal, it's binding. It's binding on Crane," Daniel said. "It's not binding on the board, and the board can find a dozen reasons to void a contract if the board wants to, and Pruitt's uncle is the board. They'll say Crane exceeded his authority. They'll say there was a technicality in the signing. They'll say whatever they need to say, and they'll say it from an office in St. Paul that you can't ride to and can't argue with. And while you're trying to fight it in a court 1,000 miles away, they'll have starved you out. He turned to Clara. That's the part I rode hard to tell you, ma'am. It's not the contract you have to worry about. Pruitt's not going to fight you on paper. Paper's slow and slow gives you a chance, and he can't afford to give you a chance. He's going to come at the thing underneath the contract. He's going to come at your ability to deliver. My supply, Clara said. Daniel nodded. You buy your own supply, that was smart. That was the smartest thing in the whole contract. It kept you out from under the company's store. But it's also the soft spot, because a woman who buys her own supply depends on the men she buys it from. And Leland Pruitt has been doing business with every supplier between here and Bighorn for 2 years. He said it quietly, and it landed like a stone dropped in a well. He doesn't have to beat you, Mrs. Whitaker. He just has to make sure that when you go to buy your flour and your beef and your beans, there isn't any to buy. Not at any price. He'll lean on the suppliers, and they'll listen, because they'd sooner lose your business than lose the railroads. And one morning, you'll wake up and find every merchant in the territory has suddenly got nothing to sell you. And then you can't feed the crews. And then you've broken the contract. And then the board voids it all regretful and hands the whole thing right back to Pruitt's outfit, and everyone in St. Paul shakes their heads about the poor ranch woman who bit off more than she could chew. He set his hat down on the table. That's the plan, ma'am. I've seen him do it before to a freight hauler out of Billings who got too big. Took him 3 weeks to break the man. And he's going to do it to you. And he's going to start now. And I rode 2 days without proper sleep to give you the one thing he doesn't know you have. Which is, Clara said, time. Daniel looked at her. A few days' warning. That's all I could get you. He doesn't know I've told you. He thinks you're going to walk into this blind the way the freight hauler did. So whatever you're going to do, Mrs. Whitaker, you've got maybe a week before the suppliers start closing their doors. Less if he moves fast. He stood exhausted. I've done what I came to do. I'll deny every word of it if I'm asked. But I couldn't watch it happen to the woman who fed those men when the company left them to starve. My own brother works that cut. He wrote me about your brisket. A ghost of a smile. I owed you. Now I've paid. He rode off into the dark, and the 3 of them stood in the kitchen he'd left behind, and for a long moment, nobody said anything at all. Then Thomas hit the table with his fist. 2 years he's been stealing from those men, he said low and furious, feeding them slop and pocketing the difference, and now he's going to break us for the crime of feeding them honest. I'd like to ride to St. Paul and drag him out of his fine office by his collar. You'd be hanged for it, and it wouldn't buy us an hour, Clara said. She hadn't moved. She was sitting exactly where she'd sat through the whole telling, her hands folded on the table, and there was a stillness on her that Thomas had learned to recognize. It was the stillness of Clara thinking. It was the stillness that had read a ledger and caught a thief and figured a plan to feed 300 men out of a dying ranch. He shut his mouth and waited, and Silas in the doorway waited, and the kitchen held its breath. He's going to close the suppliers, Clara said finally, half to herself. Every merchant between here and Bighorn. Lean on them till they've got nothing to sell me. She looked up. Silas, how many suppliers do I actually buy from beef aside? I raise my own beef. Flour, beans, coffee, sugar, salt. How many men do I depend on for that? Silas thought. 4 mostly. Bledsoe here in town, the big mill over in Bighorn, a grain outfit south of here, the Peterson brothers, and Kowalski, the wholesaler that hauls the coffee and sugar up from the rail depot. 4 men. Clara nodded slowly. And Pruitt only has to turn all 4. If even one holds, I can limp along. If all 4 close, I'm done. She stood up and began to pace the kitchen, and Thomas watched her the way he'd watched her figure the plan that saved them with a kind of desperate hope. So the question isn't, how do I fight Leland Pruitt in St. Paul? I can't. The question is, how do I get supply that Leland Pruitt can't touch? There isn't any, Silas said. Not in this territory. He can reach every supplier we've got. Then I stop depending on suppliers I've got, Clara said, and I find one he can't reach. She stopped pacing. She stood very still in the middle of the kitchen, and Thomas saw the thing happen behind her eyes that he'd seen twice before the moment the wild thought arrived, the moment she turned it over and couldn't find the hole in it. "The Peterson brothers," she said. "The grain outfit south of here. Silas, what do you know about them?" "Petersons." Silas frowned. "Norwegians. Homesteaded a big stretch of bottomland south of the river. Grow more wheat than half the county put together. Keep to themselves, don't much like the town, don't much like the railroad." He paused. "Come to think, they got no love at all for the Northern Pacific. Railroad ran its line straight through the corner of their best field 2 years back, condemned the land, paid 'em a pittance. Old Anders Peterson swore he'd never do business with the railroad again, long as he lived." And there it was. Clara felt it click into place like a key. "A man who hates the railroad," she said softly, "and grows more wheat than anyone in the county, and sells to nobody because he keeps to himself." She turned to Thomas, and her eyes had come alight. "Pruitt's going to lean on my suppliers by telling them they'll lose the railroad's business. But how do you threaten a man with losing something he's already sworn off? How do you frighten Anders Peterson with the railroad's displeasure, when the railroad's the thing he hates most in this world?" Thomas was already on his feet. "You can't threaten him at all. You can't touch him at all." Clara was moving now, quick, gathering her shawl. "Pruitt's whole plan depends on every supplier being afraid of the railroad. And there's one man in this territory who isn't afraid of the railroad, who'd sooner spit on the railroad. And if I can get to him before Pruitt even thinks to try, if I can tie up his whole crop before Pruitt knows the Petersons exist as a threat." She stopped. "Silas, saddle the fast horses, not the wagon horses. We ride at first light, all three of us, south to the Petersons, south to the Petersons, and we don't come back without a contract for every bushel of wheat Anders Peterson can grow for as long as he can grow it." Clara looked at her husband. "Pruitt thinks he's going to starve me out by closing 4 doors. I'm going to open a 5th door he doesn't know exists, and I'm going to nail it open before he ever finds it. But we have to move now, Thomas. Tonight we plan, and at dawn we ride, because Daniel gave us a week, and I don't intend to use a day of it sleeping." They rode south at first light. It was a hard ride, a full day, and more down out of the ranch country and across the dry river and into the green bottomland, where the Peterson brothers had turned a wilderness into the richest wheat farm in the territory. And the whole way Clara turned the approach over in her mind, because getting to Anders Peterson before Pruitt was only half of it. The other half was convincing a proud, private, railroad-hating Norwegian to throw in his lot with a stranger, and not just any stranger, but exactly the kind of stranger the world had taught to expect a closed door. They found the Peterson homestead in the late afternoon, and old Anders himself came out to meet them. A huge, weathered, white-bearded man with forearms like fence posts, and eyes that took one look at the 3 riders and went flat with suspicion. "We're not buying," he said before Thomas had even dismounted. "And we're not selling. Whatever you've come for, you can turn around. Mr. Peterson." Clara climbed down off her horse. Not easily, she was tired and sore from the long ride, but she did it herself and waved off Thomas when he moved to help, because she'd learned long ago that a proud man judges you by whether you can carry your own weight, and she had never once needed help carrying hers. "My name is Clara Whitaker. I've ridden a day and a half to talk to you, and I'll be brief because I can see you're a man who values his time. I want to buy your wheat. All of it. Every bushel you grow this year, and for as many years as you'll sell to me at a fair price set in writing today." Anders Peterson looked at her. He looked at her the way people always looked at her first, the flat assessing glance, the arithmetic. But there was something else in it too, because a farmer knows the value of substance, and there was substance to Clara Whitaker that a lifetime on the land had taught Anders Peterson to respect before he'd worked out why. "You're the ranch woman," he said slowly. "The one feeds the railroad crews. We heard about you even down here." His flat eyes narrowed. "And now you come wanting my wheat. Which means the railroad wants my wheat. And I told the railroad 2 years ago what it could do with—" "The railroad doesn't want your wheat, Mr. Peterson," Clara said. "The railroad wants me to fail. And a man named Leland Pruitt, the nephew of the man who runs the whole Northern Pacific, the same railroad that ran its line through your best field and paid you a pittance for it. That man is right now going around to every supplier in this territory, telling them to cut me off. And they'll do it because they're afraid of the railroad." She held his eyes. "I've come to you because you're the one man I could find who isn't." Something moved in the old farmer's weathered face. "Pruitt," he said. "Leland Pruitt. He's been stealing from those railroad crews for 2 years, feeding them slop, pocketing the difference. I started feeding them honest, and now he means to break me for it, and he means to do it by making sure I can't buy so much as a sack of flour anywhere between here and Bighorn." Clara took a step closer. "You know the railroad, Mr. Peterson. You know exactly what it is and what it does to people who get in its way. It ran its iron straight through your life and called it progress. Well, now it wants to run its iron straight through mine. And I'm asking you not as a favor, as a business deal, a good one, a fair one, to help me make sure it can't." For a long moment, Anders Peterson said nothing. The wind moved through his wheat. Somewhere a dog barked. And Clara stood there, road-worn and aching and absolutely still, and let the old man take her measure, because she'd said everything there was to say, and the rest was up to him. Then Anders Peterson turned his head and called out in Norwegian toward the house. A younger man came out, his brother or his son, Clara couldn't tell, and Anders said something to him low and fast, and the younger man's eyebrows went up, and he looked at Clara with new interest. And then Anders Peterson turned back to her, and for the first time the flat suspicion in his eyes had cracked, and underneath it was something that looked almost like the beginning of a hard old smile. "You want to hurt the Northern Pacific Railroad," he said, "by buying my wheat and feeding its own crews better than it feeds them itself, so that this Pruitt is exposed for the thief he is in front of the whole board and can't stop it because the food is too good and the men are too happy." He shook his great white head slowly. "Mrs. Whitaker, for 2 years I have wanted to hurt that railroad and found no way to do it that wouldn't hurt me worse." The hard old smile broke fully across his face. "You have just handed me a way to spit in its eye and make money doing it. Come inside. Anna will make coffee. We will write your contract and you will have every bushel I grow for 10 years, and I will plant more next spring just for the pleasure of it." Thomas let out a breath he'd been holding for a day and a half, and Clara Whitaker, standing in a wheat field a day's hard ride from home, felt the trap that Leland Pruitt had built to break her come apart in her hands, because she'd found the one door he'd forgotten to guard, and she'd nailed it open before he ever knew it was there. They wrote the contract at the Peterson kitchen table over Anna's coffee, and it was fair, and it was ironclad, and it tied up more wheat than Clara could use in 2 years, which was exactly the point. Because wheat she didn't use for cooking she could sell, and a supplier Pruitt couldn't reach was worth more than gold. Anders signed with a hand the size of a skillet. His brother Eric signed as witness. And when it was done, old Anders poured a measure of something clear and strong from a jug under the sideboard and made them all drink to it. "To the railroad," he said, raising his cup, his eyes gleaming with 2 years of banked-up spite finally finding its outlet. "May it choke on Mrs. Whitaker's good bread." They rode home the next day with the contract in Clara's saddlebag, and they made it back to the ranch near midnight exhausted and saddle-sore and triumphant, and found the ranch lit up like a fire, every lamp burning, the hands milling in the yard, and Gus Halloran hobbling toward them, fast as his bowed legs would carry him, his crooked hands waving his old face, stretched with alarm. "Thank God," Gus gasped, catching Clara's stirrup. "Thank God you're back. They came, Clara. While you were gone. They came." Clara was off her horse in an instant. "Who came, Pruitt?" "His man," Hobbs called himself, and 2 others mean-looking, the kind that carry more than they show. Gus was shaking. "Came yesterday afternoon, bold as brass, right up to the kitchen. Said he was here to make you an offer. Said the railroad had reconsidered, that there'd been a mistake with your contract, that they wanted to buy it back off you generous, more and fair. And when I said you weren't here and I didn't speak for you, he got—" The old man swallowed. He got ugly, Clara. Said it'd be a shame if you didn't take the offer. Said accidents happen to supply wagons on lonely roads. Said a woman ought to think about how much easier her life would be if she just took the money and went back to cooking for her own men and quit reaching above her station. Gus's voice cracked. I'm sorry. I'm an old man with hands that don't work, and I couldn't do a thing but stand there and take it. Silas would've, but Silas was with you, and I just had to stand there while that snake threatened your whole life in your own kitchen. Thomas had gone white with fury. I'll kill him. I swear to God I'll... You'll do no such thing, Clara said. But her voice had gone hard as the iron of her stove, and Thomas heard something in it he'd never heard before, not fear, not even anger exactly, but a cold and total resolve that made the hair stand up on his arms. Gus, this Hobbs, did he say when he'd be back? Said he'd give you 3 days to see sense. Gus wiped his face. Said after that he couldn't promise how things would go. Made it sound like weather, like it was out of his hands. 3 days. Clara stood in the lamplit yard with the wheat contract in her saddlebag and a threat hanging over her whole world. And Thomas watched her do the thing she always did. Watched her go still and think and turn the danger over, looking for the place to take hold of it. He came here to frighten me into selling the contract back. Which means the contract's still good. If he could have just voided it in St. Paul, he wouldn't have needed to send a man to threaten me. He can't void it clean. Daniel was right. If the operation succeeds, Pruitt's exposed and he knows it, and he's scared enough to send hired men to a woman's kitchen. She looked up. He's not strong, Thomas. A strong man doesn't make threats. A strong man just acts. Threats are what a man does when he's afraid the honest way won't work. Hobbs came here because Pruitt is running out of time and out of options, and he's hoping to scare me into handing him the one thing he can't take by force. That doesn't make the threat less real, Silas said quietly. He'd come up beside them, and his careful face was grim. Men like that, ma'am, the ones that talk about accidents on lonely roads, sometimes they mean it. I've known supply wagons to burn, known worse. You beat Pruitt on paper and in the wheat field, and you beat him fair. But a cornered thief with his uncle's money behind him is the most dangerous kind there is. We ought to think hard about how we protect that first delivery. Because if Pruitt can't scare you into quitting, his next move is to make sure your first wagon of contract food never reaches that cut. The yard went quiet, and Clara looked around at the faces in the lamplight. Thomas, white with fury and fear. Old Gus, trembling and ashamed. Silas, grim and steady. Caleb, wide-eyed at the edge of the crowd. Bristol with his jaw set hard and his hand already resting where a gun would ride. Her people. The people she'd fed back to life. The people who'd laughed at her in this same yard a lifetime ago and now stood ready to put their bodies between her and a hired man's threats. He wants to stop the first delivery, she said slowly. That's the whole game now, isn't it? The contract says I feed the Western crews. The first honest meal under that contract is the thing that exposes Pruitt the moment 3,000 men taste the difference and start asking why they were fed garbage for 2 years. So Pruitt has to stop that first delivery from happening. If the food gets through, he's finished. If it doesn't, I've broken the contract and he's saved. She nodded slowly, the whole shape of it clear to her now. So he'll burn my wagon, or wreck it, or scare off my drivers. Somewhere on that 30-mile road between here and the cut, he means to make sure the first contract meal never gets served. Then we don't give him 30 miles of lonely road to do it on? Thomas said. Clara looked at her husband, and slowly, for the first time since Gus had come hobbling across the yard, she smiled. No, she said. We don't. She turned to the whole gathered crowd of them, and she raised her voice so every hand could hear. Listen to me, all of you. In 3 days, that man Hobbs is coming back here, expecting to find a frightened woman ready to sell. He's going to find something else. But before that, before any of it, we've got a delivery to make, and it's the most important meal any of us will ever cook, because it's not just supper for 3,000 men. It's the meal that either exposes a thief or lets him win, and I do not intend to let him win." Her eyes swept the yard. "So here's what we're going to do, and I'm going to need every last one of you." She began to lay it out, and the hands leaned in around her in the lamplight, the whole ranch drawn tight around the woman at the center of it, and listened to Clara Whitaker turn the trap that was meant to break her into the snare that would catch the man who set it. The plan Clara laid out in the lamplit yard was simple, the way her best plans were always simple, and Thomas understood as she spoke it that its simplicity was exactly what made it deadly. Pruitt expected one wagon, a single supply wagon lumbering down 30 miles of lonely road driven by a cook and maybe a hand or two, easy to stop, easy to burn, easy to make disappear into the kind of accident that happens on empty roads. That was the picture in Hobbs's head, and Clara meant to give him exactly that picture, right up until the moment it fell apart in his hands. "We send a decoy," she said. "One wagon loaded light driven slow, taking the main road, the lonely road, the one Hobbs already scouted, the one he's counting on. Silas drives it. Bristol rides alongside, and it looks from any distance like a woman's whole hope rolling down the road unguarded." She let that land. "But it's empty of anything that matters. Sacks of sawdust under a tarp. Enough real food on top to fool a man who rides up close, but nothing we can't lose." "And the real delivery?" Silas asked. "Goes the other way, north around the long side before dawn, while Hobbs is watching the main road. 3 wagons, not one loaded to the axles, driven by men I trust with guns they know how to use, and me at the front of it." Clara's eyes moved across the gathered hands. "By the time Hobbs figures out the wagon he stopped is full of sawdust, 3,000 railroad men will already be eating the first honest meal that contract ever bought. And once they've eaten it, once they've tasted the difference and started asking the questions Pruitt can't afford them to ask, there won't be a thing on God's earth Leland Pruitt can do to put that back in the bottle." The yard was silent. Then Bristol spoke up from the edge of the crowd, his jaw set hard. "He'll be armed, ma'am. Hobbs and them too. When they stop that decoy and find it's sawdust, they'll be sore, and sore men with guns do ugly things. You're asking Silas and me to sit on a lonely road and let armed men ride up on us knowing we've got nothing they want." "I'm asking you to buy me 2 hours," Clara said. "That's all. You don't fight them. You don't die for a wagon of sawdust. I'd never forgive myself, and neither would you. You let them stop you. You let them search. You play the part of 2 men caught out and frightened, and you let them think they've won, and you give the real wagons 2 hours head start up the north road. Then you go home." She held Bristol's eyes. "Nobody dies for this, Bristol. Not on my account. This is a plan built so that the worst that happens to any of my people is a bad afternoon on a dusty road. I've had enough of men getting hurt so that other men can steal. That's the whole thing I'm fighting. I'll not become it to win." Bristol looked at her a long moment. Then he nodded slow, and something in his hard face eased. 2 hours, he said. "We can give you 2 hours." They moved before dawn. The north road was rougher and longer, and it climbed hard through broken country, and the 3 loaded wagons groaned and lurched over it in the dark, while Silas and Bristol, a full valley away, rolled the decoy out onto the main road. At first light, slow and easy, a lamb walking itself to the wolf. Clara rode at the head of the real column with Thomas beside her, and she did not let herself think about the men she'd sent down the other road until they were over the last hard rise and the railroad cut opened up below them in the gray morning, a mile of raw earth already swarming with the first men of the day shift. And the shout went up. It went up the way it always did, one man spotting the wagons on the rise. Then 100 men. Then the whole cut, a roar rolling down the length of it that Clara felt in her chest like a second heartbeat. The angel of the cut. Except this morning, it wasn't one wagon. It was 3 loaded to the axles, and the men who came running understood something had changed, that this was bigger, that this was the beginning of the thing they'd been promised. Clara didn't waste a minute. She had the stoves fired and the meat on before the first 100 had lined up. And she cooked the way she'd never cooked in her life, fast and sure, and enormous feeding, not 300 now, but the front of a line that stretched back the whole mile of the cut and didn't stop stretching. Word ran ahead of the food. Men came off the grade who weren't even due to eat, drawn by the smell and the shouting and the news running man to man. It's real, it's the contract, it's her, and it's better than anything, and there's enough for everybody. And they ate. 3,000 men over the course of that long morning and into the afternoon ate the first honest meal the Northern Pacific's Western Division had served in 2 years, and Clara watched the thing she'd known would happen begin to happen. Watched it move through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Because a man who's been fed garbage for 2 years and suddenly gets fed like a human being doesn't just feel grateful. He feels something else. First, something sharper. He feels robbed. He looks down at the good food on his plate, and he thinks if this is what it costs and this is what's possible, then what in God's name have they been feeding me, and where did the difference go? She heard it start. She heard it in the line man-to-man low and then not low at all. 2 years of hardtack, and they had this the whole time. Somebody's been pocketing the difference, that's what. Somebody in the company, sure as I'm standing here. This costs the same to make less, even done honest. Where's the money been going? By afternoon, it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was 3,000 men putting the same question together at the same time, and Clara stood at her stoves and fed them and let the question spread, because the question was the whole point. The question was the thing Leland Pruitt could not survive. Every honest meal she served drove it deeper, and there was no meal she could serve that wouldn't drive it deeper. And that was the trap she'd built. A trap made entirely of feeding people. Well, a trap. Pruitt could only escape by making sure the food never came, and the food had come 3 wagons of it up a road he wasn't watching. Hobbs found the sawdust around midday. Clara learned the details later from Silas, told over the kitchen table with Bristol filling in the parts Silas was too modest to tell. How the 3 riders had come up on the decoy wagon slow and easy, sure of themselves, Hobbs grinning. How they'd made Silas and Bristol climb down and stand aside. How Hobbs had thrown back the tarp, expecting the ruin of Clara Whitaker's whole enterprise, and found instead sack after sack of clean pine sawdust, with a note sitting on top that Clara had written the night before and left where he'd be sure to find it. Silas had memorized it. He recited it flat, but his eyes were dancing. It said, Silas told them, Mr. Hobbs, by the time you read this, 3,000 men are eating a meal your Mr. Pruitt would have paid a great deal to prevent. You are welcome to the sawdust. I'd suggest you use it to soak up the mess your employer is about to be standing in. Yours sincerely, Clara Whitaker. The kitchen roared. Even Gus, who'd wept telling them about the threat 3 nights before, laughed till he had to sit down wiping his crooked hands across his eyes. And Thomas laughed hardest of all. His arm around his wife, his whole body shaking with it, because he'd spent 3 days sick with fear for her. And here was the fear turned inside out and made ridiculous a hired thug standing in the road holding a note, a mile of sawdust, and nothing. What did he do? Clara asked. When he read it, Silas's grin faded a little and he glanced at Bristol. That's the part I'd have you hear plain, ma'am, Silas said. Because it's not all funny. He was angry. Angry like I've not often seen a man. He took that note and he read it twice, and his face went the color of ash, and he looked at Bristol and me, and for a second... Silas paused. For a second I thought we'd have to fight after all. His hand went to his gun, but then the other 2, they weren't fighters. They were just muscle, and they didn't like the odds of shooting 2 men dead over sawdust on a public road in daylight with no notion who might come along, so they talked him down. And Hobbs, he put his gun away, and he pointed at me, and he said... Silas met Clara's eyes. He said, You tell that woman this isn't finished. You tell her Mr. Pruitt doesn't lose. You tell her she'd best sleep light. The laughter had gone out of the kitchen. Clara nodded slowly. She'd expected something like it. A cornered man doesn't stop being dangerous just because you've beaten him once. Sometimes the beating is exactly what makes him dangerous. Pruitt had gambled on stopping the first delivery, and he'd lost that gamble, And now he was a thief who'd been exposed to 3,000 men with nothing left to lose. "Then we're not done," she said quietly. "We won the first move, but a man like Pruitt with his uncle's money and his back to the wall, Silas is right. He'll come again, and next time he won't bother with sawdust and threats. He'll come to hurt somebody." She looked around the table at the faces she loved. "And I'll not have it. I'll not spend the next year of all our lives sleeping light and watching the road. That's no way to live, and it's no way to build the thing I mean to build. So we don't wait for his next move. We end it. Now, before he can make one." "End it how?" Thomas said. "He's 1,000 miles away in St. Paul behind his uncle and the whole board of the railroad. You said yourself we can't reach him." "We can't reach Pruitt," Clara said. "But Pruitt's whole power is a secret. His name's not on the supply outfit. Daniel told us it's all done through Hobbs and a front man. Pruitt's uncle protects him because nobody can prove the theft leads to Pruitt. The moment it's proven, the moment there's something the board can't look away from and the newspapers can't be kept from, then Augustus Thorne can't shield his nephew anymore because shielding him would mean going down with him." She leaned forward. "Pruitt's safe as long as it's whispers. He's finished the second it's proof. So I'm not going to fight Leland Pruitt. I'm going to hand 3,000 angry men the proof and let them do it for me." She sent word up and down the cut over the following days, quiet and careful the way word travels in a railroad camp. She had Daniel Hirsch's name, and Daniel had names of his own other clerks, other men in other offices who'd watched Pruitt skim for 2 years and hated it, and been too afraid to speak. She had the 2 years of bad food itself remembered in the belly of every man who'd choked it down. And she had the one thing that turns a grievance into a weapon. She had a comparison. For 2 years, the men had eaten garbage and had nothing to measure it against. So they'd blamed the company in a general hopeless way, the way men blame weather. Now they had her food. Now they knew exactly what honest provisioning tasted like, and exactly what it cost. And the gap between what they'd been fed and what they should have been fed had a shape and a size, and Clara made sure of this a name. She didn't accuse Pruitt herself. She was too smart for that. A ranch woman accusing a railroad director's nephew would be dismissed in a heartbeat. Instead, she did what she'd always done. She laid out the truth so plain that other people couldn't help but see it. She showed the men her cost open, honest, every figure. This is what it costs to feed you right. This is what the company was charged. This is the difference. She let them do the arithmetic she'd have done, and 3,000 men did it. And the answer had Leland Pruitt's name on it, and the answer traveled. It traveled up the line to other camps. It traveled into town. It traveled carried by a foreman here and a clerk there and a letter home from a worker to a brother. Who knew a man who worked for a newspaper all the way to St. Paul until the whispers Pruitt had survived for 2 years became something else entirely, became a roar too loud for even Augustus Thorne to pretend he couldn't hear. The reckoning, when it came fast. Harlan Crane rode out to the ranch himself to deliver it, and this time there was no warm smile and no cold eyes. There was just a tired, grimly satisfied man who climbed down off his horse and took off his hat and looked at Clara with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Something close to reverence. "It's done," he said. "I thought you'd want to hear it from me since I'm the one who signed you and I'm the one it nearly cost." He turned the hat in his hands. "Leland Pruitt is finished. The board met last week. The evidence was it was more than a man's uncle could paper over. There were too many men, too many figures, too many honest clerks who'd been waiting years for someone to make it safe to talk. Your operation made it safe to talk, Mrs. Whitaker. Once the men had your food to compare against the whole 2 years of theft, laid itself out plain. And once it was plain, Augustus Thorne had a choice: protect his nephew and go down with him, or cut him loose and save himself." Crane almost smiled. "He cut him loose. Pruitt's front outfit is dissolved. Pruitt himself is gone, resigned. They're calling it, though everyone knows what it was. And Thorne, to save his own skin, has spent the last week loudly championing honest provisioning and pointing to a certain ranch in Montana as the model the whole railroad ought to follow." "On, Padre," Bill said. Thomas made a sound that was half laugh, half disbelief. The man who protected Pruitt is now praising Clara. The man who protected Pruitt is now claiming he discovered Clara, Crane said dryly. That's how it works up there. But it means something for you, and that's why I wrote out. Your contract's not just safe now, Mrs. Whitaker. It's blessed. The board's endorsed it publicly. They want to hold you up as the example, the honest supplier who exposed the rot, and they'll extend you every camp on the Western Division and half the Northern besides if you'll take them. He put his hat back on. You didn't just beat Leland Pruitt. You made yourself so valuable to the men who'd have let him break you that now they'll fight anyone who tries. There's no safer place in this whole railroad than the place you've built. You made yourself untouchable, ma'am, and you did it by feeding people well. I've been in this business 30 years, and I've never seen the like. He mounted up to go. Then he paused and looked down at her one more time. That threat, he said. The man Hobbs. Sleep light. I heard about it. His jaw tightened. You won't be hearing from Hobbs again, or anyone like him. Pruitt's got no money and no protection now, and a man like Hobbs doesn't work for free. Whatever they told you on that road, it's over. You can sleep sound, Mrs. Whitaker. You've earned it about 10 times over. And he rode off, and Clara stood in the yard with Thomas and let the truth of it settle over her, slowly, the way she let most things settle once all the way through. It was over, not paused, not survived for now, over. The thief was gone. The contract was blessed, the danger was lifted, and the thing she'd built out of a dying ranch and a wagon of brisket stood whole and safe and endorsed by the very men who'd nearly let it die. She'd won. The seasons turned, and the Whitaker Ranch turned with them into something no one who'd watched Clara step down off that stagecoach could have imagined. The provisioning operation grew until it wasn't a wagon or 3 wagons, but a whole enterprise, a cookhouse built beside the ranch, big enough to feed an army supply wagons, rolling out daily to camps across 2 divisions of the railroad, a name known from St. Paul to the Western Territories as the outfit that fed men honest. Anders Peterson plowed new fields every spring just to keep up and grew rich doing it, and never once stopped delighting in the fact that his wheat was feeding the very railroad he despised better than the railroad had ever fed itself. Bledsoe, the merchant who'd tried to partner with Clara and been refused, watched her business grow past his own and had to come to her hat in hand, asking for the privilege of being a small supplier, and Clara gave it to him. Fair terms, honest terms, no cruelty in it, because she'd learned long ago that the best answer to a small man is to be too large to bother hating him, and she hired women. That was the thing Clara did that no one expected, and that mattered in the end more than the money. As the operation grew, she needed cooks, dozens of them, and she went and found the women that towns like hers had always overlooked, the 2 large women, the 2 plain women, the widows and the spinsters, and the ones the world had decided were good for nothing because they didn't match a picture. She found them scrubbing floors and taking in washing and being told they were lucky to have it, and she offered them real work at real wages, and she taught them what Gus had taught her, and she watched them become one after another exactly what she had become. People who could feed an army and knew their own worth, and would never again apologize for the space they took up in the world. She trained them at the same kitchen table where she'd read Thomas's ledger that first morning. And she told each new woman the same thing, the thing she'd learned in a lifetime of teachers who'd meant to be cruel. Every person who ever underestimated you, Clara would say, was doing you a kindness they never intended. They were teaching you. They were showing you exactly how much stronger you were than they knew. You take that lesson, and you feed these men like they matter, and you watch their faces change, and you never, not once, apologize for being exactly the size and shape and self that God made you. Because I promise you, the whole world will try to make you small, and the whole world is wrong. I've fed 3,000 men who'd tell you so. Gus Halloran lived to see all of it. The old cook whose ruined hands had pointed Clara through her first supper on the ranch became the grand old man of the cookhouse. Too crippled to lift a pot, but sat in a good chair by the big stove where he could see everything, teaching the young women the 1,000 tricks he'd taught Clara, telling stories about the old railroad days, delighting in every wagon that rolled out. He told Clara once near the end of his life in a quiet moment, when the cookhouse had emptied for the night, the thing he'd been holding since that first evening. "Eleanor was a fine woman," he said. "I want you to know I never once compared you to her and found you wanting. Folks might have thought I would, an old man loyal to the dead. But Clara," his voice cracked with age, cracked further. "Eleanor kept a fine house and cooked a fine Sunday supper and loved that man true. But she couldn't have done what you did. Not in 1,000 years. It took you. It had to be you. Whatever cruelty sent you to that man off a stagecoach, whatever hard road you rode to get here, it was the road that made you the only person alive who could have saved this place. And I've thanked God more than once for every mile of it, hard as it must have been to walk." He patted her hand with his crooked one. "You were never the mistake, girl. You were the answer. You just got here before anybody knew the question." Clara held the old man's ruined hand and could not speak. And Thomas. Thomas Whitaker became over those years the man Clara had glimpsed underneath the grief on the very first day. A good man, a kind man, a man who laughed easy and worked hard and stood beside his wife in front of the whole world without a shadow of the shame that had nearly cost him everything. He never got over what he'd been that first day. He said so more than once. But he didn't wallow in it either, because Clara wouldn't let him, because she'd told him plain that a man who spends his life apologizing for an old sin is no use to anybody. And the only real apology was to spend the rest of his days making sure she never doubted her worth again. He kept that apology. Every day of his life he kept it. They had children. 2 of them, a boy and then a girl, born into a house full of light and food, and the constant coming and going of the women Clara had lifted up, born to a father who looked at their mother the way a man looks at the sun, and a mother who had never once in their whole lives taught them to be ashamed of anything. The boy grew up broad and easy like his father. The girl grew up large like her mother, and Clara watched the world get ready to tell her daughter all the things it had spent a lifetime telling her, and Clara got there first. Every time. She raised a daughter who never learned to apologize for her body because her mother had burned that lesson out of the house before it could ever take root, replaced it with a different lesson, the true one that a person's worth was never the size of them, but the size of what they built, and the size of what they gave, and the size of the love they were brave enough to fight for. Years later, many years later, there was an evening that Clara would think of when she thought about the whole long road of it as the one that held everything. The cookhouse was full. It was some celebration, a harvest, or a wedding, or a christening. Clara could never afterward remember which. Only that the whole ranch was there, and half the county besides, and the tables groaned with food, and the women she'd trained moved among the crowd, proud and strong, and her grown children laughed somewhere in the noise, and Thomas Gray, now slower now, but hers entirely, and forever, hers, sat beside her with his hand over hers on the table. And a young woman came in. She came in off a wagon, a stranger large and plain and travel-worn, come seeking work, because she'd heard, everyone had heard by then, that there was a place in Montana where a woman like her could find honest work and honest wages and be treated like she mattered. She came in through the door and stopped the way people always stopped, taking in the noise and the light and the impossible warmth of it, bracing herself the way Clara had once braced herself for the held breath and the laughing. There was no laughing. There was only Clara Whitaker rising from her table, crossing the room the way she'd once crossed a kitchen full of doubting men and taking the frightened stranger's hands in both of hers. "You've come a long way," Clara said. "You must be hungry. Sit down. There's a plate for you. There's always a plate here for anybody, and there always will be." She smiled, and the young woman saw in that smile something she had never once seen aimed at her in her whole hard life. Welcome without condition, without judgment, without the arithmetic. "And when you've eaten, if you want work, you've got it. I built this whole place for women exactly like you and me. We feed the whole territory now, and we never ever apologize for taking up room in the world." The young woman's eyes filled. She sat down. Clara filled her plate high, too high, the way she always had, because a hungry person's first look at a plate is the whole thing. And she watched the stranger take that first bite, and she watched the exact moment a person who'd been told her whole life that she was too much remembered that she was in fact enough. Thomas came up beside his wife and put his arm around her and watched the young woman eat. "You know what I thought," he said quietly, "the day you stepped off that coach. I know exactly what you thought, Thomas. I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my life." He pulled her close. "And I had never in my life been so wrong about anything, or so grateful to be wrong." He kissed the top of her gray head. "You were the best thing that ever happened to me, Clara Whitaker. You were the best thing that ever happened to this ranch and this county and every soul you ever fed and lifted and taught. And the whole world thought you were a mistake, and the whole world was a fool. And you proved it not with anger, not with bitterness, but with bread. You fed them all until they had to admit the truth." Clara Whitaker looked out over the crowded cookhouse, over the women she'd raised up, the children she'd raised right, the husband who'd learned to see her, the stranger eating her first honest meal, the whole warm, shining world she had built out of 2 leather bags and a marriage nobody wanted, and a body the world had told her to apologize for, and she never not once had. They'd laughed when she stepped off that stagecoach. They'd called her a mistake, a burden, a church social, a woman who surely couldn't cook. And she had answered them the only way she'd ever needed to. Not with words, not with fury, but by feeding a starving corner of the world back to life, until every last soul who doubted her stood in line at her table, hat in hand, grateful, and understood at last what they had so nearly thrown away. The woman everyone underestimated became the heart of the ranch, the heart of the territory. The reason 1,000 forgotten women learned they were enough, and the wife they said couldn't cook fed the whole world back to life, and never once in all her days apologized for a single beautiful inch of who she was.